The area around him consisted of nothing but trees, and when he saw this, the boy understood only one thing, namely, that he had entered another world. The boy looked with interest at the huge white wolf lying next to him. However, he was not afraid of this situation that had arisen. The black-haired guy just smiled brightly and lay down with his arms on the beast. He was happy. When the wolf touched him, he also noticed its pleasant fluffiness. They say that when something unexpected happens, the mind becomes cloudy. That's roughly the situation the guy found himself in. He, hovering in space, tried to examine the surrounding area with curiosity. The guy wanted to know about the place where he was at the moment. His name was Tenno Akiro, and he was 35 years old. Tenno didn't understand why he was in this place. The boy frowned and tried to recall his last memories of what he was doing. That day, his mind was foggy in the morning, causing him to oversleep. But as always, Tenno went to his work, and then after work, he headed home holding his phone in his hands. As he crossed the crosswalk, the boy was reading a message from his sister. The girl asked him to buy yogurt on the way home. Tenno had already bought it and wanted to get home as soon as possible. But his plans were ruined. After all, the guy did not notice how a truck was mercilessly heading towards him. Therefore, Tenno did not have time to escape from the collision with the truck and collided with it. The guy remembered how he was hit by the truck. Then he came back from his memories and noticed the things around him. Turning around, he noticed that there were 4 more people who had been hit by the car. They were unconscious. At that moment, a group of 4 people were covered in a bright light. The guy looked at it in surprise. He realized that they were glowing and thought that the group was conscious. Then he also noticed with interest that he was not covered by a bright light. Suddenly, a desperate voice was heard. The voice said out loud to itself with panic what to do now. Tenno started to turn around to find the source of the voice. But there was no one around him. But someone continued to scream very loudly. Also, the rest of the group of people simply disappeared somewhere. The voice continued to sound in space. It was talking to someone about how they had been found. Another voice was saying that it could do nothing more. Suddenly, one of them noticed that there was one more person left in the space. Tenno listened to their conversation with awkwardness. Then the voices noticed the black-haired guy who remained in the space with a surprised cry. They hadn't paid any attention to him before. Tenno, listening to their conversation, realized that he should not have been part of this, even though he was with the other 4 people just recently. The guy thought about it. Then, the voice sounded in the space again. The unknown indignantly reminded his interlocutor that he had told him that summoning was a bad idea, violating the laws of the world. The interlocutor could not answer the unknown's words. Then, the voice continued to say that his interlocutor still used his summoning skill, being a newbie. A second voice was heard. It tried to justify itself. Tenno listened to their conversation with surprise. Suddenly, the black-haired boy began to disappear from space. Tenno realized with horror that he was falling down. He did not understand what would happen to him. After a while, the boy found himself in the forest. Tenno looked up in surprise. The dense foliage of the trees appeared to him. The boy didn't understand where he was. He rose from the ground with a heavy weight. Tenno felt tired. His body was very heavy and sluggish. Then the boy stood up. After he got up, he saw a forest. Tenno realized with bitterness that he was in a forest. Then he started walking forward. He wanted to leave this place as soon as possible. However, the forest was dark and scary, which made him afraid. The boy began to wonder where he was. Judging by what he heard from the conversation of unknown voices, perhaps Tenno got into some kind of hero summoning ritual. The boy smiled at the thought. Tenno remembered that his sister liked comics where the main character was summoned to another world. His sister always told him stories like this, but he never thought that something like this could happen to him, namely, being summoned to another world like a hero or stories like this. Tenno realized that the place he had landed in was another world. He wondered if there was a way to return to his world. Suddenly, the boy froze in anger. He thought about his situation with anger. Then Tenno shouted out loudly, in anger, everything he thought about the situation that had happened to him. The echo of his voice carried through the forest. Now the guy felt a little better. At the moment, he needed to calm down and think about the whole situation that had arisen with him. Tenno thought about it. If his sister had told him about what would happen in other worlds. The boy remembered that usually in other worlds there was magic and demons. Thinking about the existence of demons in this world, he realized with fright that he had screamed too loudly a minute ago. The boy turned around, but to his relief, no one appeared in response to his loud scream. Then, sighing, Tenno realized that his situation was truly dire. He didn't feel very well. The boy had been feeling like something was clinging to his body ever since he woke up. The guy looked at his palm. The sensations that arose in him were similar to something slowly penetrating his body. Then Tenno looked around, but he was only met by the rustling of the forest trees' leaves in the breeze. The boy realized that he should ask someone for help, but all he saw along the way were just trees. He felt himself getting worse after waking up in this place. Tenno had never felt so tired as he did at this moment. The boy also noticed that the forest he was in was very gloomy. He thought about the possibility that this forest had a curse that made him tired. He also had the thought that it was an evil spirit in the forest. However, the guy, with such assumptions, tried to drive the depressing thoughts out of his head. Suddenly, the wind in the forest became stronger, because of which the swaying leaves on the trees began to rustle madly. Suddenly, the boy felt a touch on his hand. At that very moment, Tenno shuddered in fear. He muttered a quiet, embarrassed spell of purification to himself to make the evil go away. The wind suddenly began and then suddenly disappeared. There was complete silence in the forest. The boy realized his stupid actions with embarrassment. He was afraid of something, although he didn't even know if such things as magic and spirits existed in this place. Tenno sighed heavily, but then he noticed something. He looked at his palm in surprise. The boy felt much lighter than before. Tenno realized that his vitality in his body had been restored. Then the boy turned towards the forest. Tenno looked at the thick smoke that appeared in the forest. Then he loudly said a purification spell, pointing his palm towards the dark smoke. The next moment after the boy used the purification spell, the black and thick smoke began to slowly dissipate. The boy looked at his palm in a little shock, which he pointed at the black house. Tenno did so, and the black smoke dissipated. Then Tenno realized with horror that the evil spirit was actually inside him. It turned out that this was a world in which magic could be used after all. Tenno continued to think that it was good to escape reality sometimes. After all, he now knew that magic existed in this world. Suddenly, the silence in the forest was broken. Loud footsteps of a huge creature were heard behind the guy. Tenno froze in fear. The guy began to turn around in horror. At that very moment, a menacing growl was heard from the monster. Tenno then turned around completely, trying to see the creature. It turns out that there was a wolf of enormous size behind the guy. Tenno was immediately scared at the sight of the huge size of the animal. For a moment, the black-haired boy thought that there was a dog in front of him, but it was a wolf. It looked at Tenno with a predatory gaze. The boy didn't understand what he should do in such a situation. It would be stupid to start a fight with such an opponent. Tenno carefully rose from his knees and tried to slowly and quietly leave. But suddenly, the wolf took a step forward. Tenno was immediately scared by the wolf's actions. He was sure that the monster would immediately chase him if he started running. The boy desperately hoped that the wolf would just leave him alone. Then Tenno began to look at the huge wolf. The black-haired boy noticed that the animal's legs were shaking. However, he forgot about it. In any case, the boy was more of a prey in this situation than this wolf. Therefore, Tenno wanted to get out of this place. At the same moment as the boy moved, the wolf tried to immediately head towards him with a growl. Tenno screamed in fear from the wolf's actions. However, the next second, the monster, instead of approaching the guy and attacking him, fell powerlessly to the ground. The boy looked at the lying wolf in shock. The monster grinned and looked back at Tenno, trying to defend itself from the possibility of an attack. Then Tenno noticed that the wolf was also suffering from the black smoke that had appeared in the forest. The monster, although it was lying powerlessly on the ground, was watching the boy with a menacing grin. Tenno, although scared, wanted to do something. Namely, the boy had to help this wolf. Although he was scared, he used to really like playing with animals. Also, the purification magic had worked on him some time ago, meaning he wouldn't be affected by the black smoke. However, Tenno was still scared because of the wolf that terrified him. But he still thought that he should try to save the wolf, so the guy pointed his palm towards the animal. Then, at that very moment, Tenno cast a purification spell on the wolf. The black smoke that surrounded the huge animal's body began to quickly disappear. Tenno realized with a smile that the purification magic had worked. Now the wolf was not subject to the dangerous influence of the black smoke. The wolf looked at him, dumbfounded. The animal did not understand what was happening and where the black smoke that surrounded it had disappeared to. The wolf looked at its body with curiosity, not feeling tired. Tenno was touched by the giant wolf's actions. He wanted to pet it. Even though it was huge, the wolf now looked more cool than scary. The huge wolf was still dirty. Tenno, as a true Japanese, loved cleanliness. Meanwhile, the white wolf headed towards the guy. It was only when the wolf approached him that Tenno came to his senses. He thought with fear that it wanted to attack him. The boy became wary. However, instead of attacking, the wolf laid down on its back, exposing its belly to the boy. With this action, it showed that it trusted Tenno. The boy looked at the lying wolf with admiration. The wolf's fluffy belly looked impressive. Then the wolf stood up, his fluffy tail wagging from side to side. The boy thought about how to clean the dirt off the animal. He hoped that magic could help him with that. After that, the guy used a cleaning spell. At that moment, the wolf's dirty fur instantly turned clean. The wolf began to look much nicer than before. Tenno was already looking at the charming wolf with surprise. He couldn't take his eyes off the pleasant-looking animal. Meanwhile, the wolf headed towards the forest, and only then did the boy wake up from looking at the wolf. He asked the animal in shock if it was going to leave. Then the huge wolf just looked back at him and looked at him with a penetrating gaze. After a while, the guy and the wolf were running fast somewhere. Tenno tried to run ahead of the wolf so as not to be left behind. The wolf just looked at the man in surprise. He realized that he was not an ordinary guy. 200 years ago, this forest was instantly enveloped in darkness. It wasn't something that anyone could do, but humanity managed to do it, one way or another. And ever since the forest began to be consumed by darkness, the forest animals have been captured by it too. The weak monsters were eliminated, while the strong inhabitants of the forest survived. Among the survivors was King Fenrir. He had been watching over this forest for the past 200 years and had witnessed countless destruction of the forest inhabitants. His magic power was enough to keep the darkness from consuming him for a while. The cleansing magic he used to keep the darkness away was temporary. The spells that needed to be chanted consumed a large amount of his magic. By repeating them, the wolf was depleting his reserves much faster than usual. King Fenrir had been in the forest for a long time and had used too much magic. At this rate, he didn't think he could hold out much longer under the oppression of darkness. However, the wolf did not allow such thoughts. He hated people because of the darkness that had appeared. Fenrir wanted to destroy everyone before he was eliminated by the darkness. He was consumed by hatred for people. Suddenly, King Fenrir smelled a human in the distance. He rushed towards the human with furious anger. The wolf wanted to eliminate him. There was only one thought in his head. A huge desire to destroy a representative of the human race consumed him. The wolf ran towards the man with fury. Soon he could see a black-haired man in front of him. It was Tenno. However, Fenrir did not lose the desire to destroy the guy for a moment. As the wolf approached him, he realized that he was indeed a human. But suddenly Fenrir's powers left him, causing him to be unable to stay in place. King Fenrir grinned menacingly at the man. He was disappointed that he had fallen without strength. The wolf had not expected to be so weak. All he could do was breathe heavily from exhaustion and glare menacingly at his enemy. When suddenly the boy started to approach him, the wolf didn't want it. However, the darkness was absorbing his life force, causing his vision to become cloudy. Fenrir didn't want to lose consciousness at such a moment. The wolf felt a great disappointment from his defenselessness and weakness in front of a representative of the human race. He could only lie powerlessly on the ground. Suddenly, King Fenrir felt an overwhelming feeling. The influence of darkness evaporated and his body instantly felt lighter. The wolf looked at the boy who used purification magic on him in surprise. He thought that the effect of this magic would rather be temporary. In normal cases, he should have had a return from the magic soon. However, after a while, the wolf did not feel the return. There was none. He was surprised by the amount of purifying magic that was overflowing from the man. Tenno looked at the wolf questioningly. King Fenrir felt the purification magic begin to spread throughout his body and heal him. He was overwhelmed by the feeling. The wolf had never seen such precise and bottomless magical power. He looked at the boy again with a menacing grin. The man immediately became wary but was not afraid of him. This was the first time King Fenrir had accepted someone as his guest. However, he had no qualms about expressing his obedience to the Tenno. After a while, the guy climbed up, right to the top of the hill, which had a flat surface with fauna on top. Tenno climbed up the slope with ease. The wolf was also climbing next to him. The guy did not feel any fatigue from such a load. On the contrary, he was pleased that all his muscles were working. Then the black-haired boy noticed King Fenrir climb up and head somewhere. Tenno was attracted by the wolf's actions. It turned out that a cave was waiting for them ahead. It was completely engulfed in dangerous darkness. Fenrir, sensing the darkness, immediately bared his teeth menacingly. The guy understood from his actions that he wanted to go into this cave, but he still asked his companion about it. The wolf immediately nodded at his question, from which Tenno came delighted with Fenrir's cute actions. A cave appeared before them. There was no end in sight. All that was clear was that the darkness had completely engulfed the cave. After a while, the guy finally headed towards the cave. Everything looked suspicious to him. Tenno had a bad feeling about everything. He didn't want to go in. However, his side was lightly poked by a slightly indignant wolf. Then Tenno had to awkwardly say that he was just joking. Then the boy used purification magic on the entrance. After the boy used the purification magic, the darkness in the cave began to slowly disappear, and in the end, there was a little darkness left in the cave. Now it became much brighter. And that's when the boy entered the cave. Tenno was surprised that the curse from this place had not completely gone away. He wondered how big this place was. Suddenly, the guy in front of him noticed something. Namely, he saw the glowing eyes of the creatures in the darkness. Tenno realized that this place was still where the wolves lived. A pack of wolves with a predatory and menacing grin looked at the boy. However, the future attack of the wolves on the boy was stopped by King Fenrir. He growled menacingly, trying to calm them down. Only after that did the wolves calm down a little. Although they did not stop looking at the guy warily, darkness hovered around their bodies. Tenno noticed this, so he cast purification magic on them. At that moment, the wolves felt the curse of darkness begin to leave them. The boy looked at the heartbreaking scene that appeared to him in horror. The wolves parted in front of him, and a bunch of other sick wolves appeared in front of him, all of them affected by the darkness, so much so that they were destroyed by it. Fenrir looked at his sick subordinates destroyed by darkness with evil hopelessness. The other wolves, who were not so weakened, were also saddened by the death of their relatives. Tenno felt sad at their saddened appearance. He decided to deal with this situation by any means necessary and help the wolf pack. Then the boy imagined how the curse retreated much more strongly this time. At the same time, he began to use purification magic. White light filled the cave and headed towards the wolves seriously ill with the curse. A stream of purification magic began to envelop the creatures' bodies. A moment later, the darkness along with the bodies of the dead wolves began to gradually disappear. The guy with the wolves looked at this sadly. Then the boy turned his attention to the creatures. He noticed that there were not only wolves, but also dogs. Tenno was surprised that the wolves and dogs were together. Then the guy with slight disgust also noticed that the animals were dirty. After his words about dirt, the creatures became even more sad. Tenno was surprised to see that the animals understood what he was saying. Then he cast purification magic on them. The next moment, the wolves and dogs looked pleasant. Their fur became silky and clean. The boy looked at them with a smile. They looked much friendlier now. After tidying up the pack of wolves and dogs, Tenno thought about what to do. He noticed 2 more passages in the cave, leading somewhere deeper. The boy became interested in this and asked Fenrir about what was in these 2 passages. However, King Fenrir had no idea about it. Tenno realized that the animals understood him after all. He wondered if he could rely on them. Then he continued walking forward. The deeper he went into the underground passage, the darker everything became. The guy noticed this and wondered about the reason for this. Then he used purification magic. After a while, Tenno continued on his way. As he walked forward, the black-haired boy also did not forget to cast purification magic on the area. Some more time passed. The boy realized with concern that the darkness did not end, although he had used purification magic many times. Soon Tenno also discovered that the wolf was once again being cursed by darkness. This was not good for them. The boy had to think of something quickly, and then he had the idea to use a barrier and protect them from the curse. It was a good idea, but it was a little hard for Tenno to imagine. And finally, he came up with the idea of combining the barrier for everyone into one, instead of wasting energy on barriers for each. The boy immediately cast a barrier spell on the pack of wolves that accompanied him. A warm light surrounded them. The animals instantly felt better. Tenno saw the barrier surrounding them and knew that his spell had worked. He also wondered if the barrier would also protect them from physical attacks. He still didn't know what would be in the depths of the underground passage. So the guy thought about strengthening the barrier. He wanted it to be able to repel magical and physical attacks. The next moment, the guy wanted to try adding a defensive function to the barrier against attacks. He applied a strengthening spell to the barrier. After that, the barrier became thicker and had a stronger structure than before. Surprised, Fenrir looked at the man questioningly. Then Tenno explained to him that he simply strengthened the barrier around everyone. Now they will be fine. Then the boy and the pack of wolves continued their journey through the underground passage. Tenno also did not forget to pay attention to clearing the darkness in the passage. After a while, the boy excitedly noticed that this cave was much larger than he thought. However, he did not stop and continued on his way. Ahead of them, only darkness awaited them. Tenno began to think about how he could use magic to get rid of the darkness in the cave. The only things that came to mind were night vision or clairvoyance. He had no clear idea of what exactly he should imagine to solve this situation, namely, the question of recognizing the shape of the surrounding space. Then the guy used the spells of night vision and spatial awareness. At the same time, he closed his eyes. At that moment, the guy with his eyes closed saw the space of the cave. Even though it was just a projection in his head, it all felt so real. Then the boy wanted to cleanse every inch of this place. Tenno used his purification magic on the cave. Then, when the darkness in the cave disappeared, to prevent darkness from appearing in this place again, he set up a barrier. Tenno looked at the cleared cave with a smile. Now he could see it clearly. Suddenly, the whole pack of wolves bared their teeth and growled menacingly, looking somewhere in one direction. The guy looked at them with concern. Tenno turned to the side where the animals were grinning. A huge black boulder appeared in front of him. The guy was surprised by this. However, at that very moment, an explosion occurred. A bright light illuminated the cave. The guy only had time to cover his eyes from the bright light. Then he looked at the dark boulder again with a cold sweat. It was pressed into the wall. Tenno was frightened and dumbfounded by the incident. The boy realized that something had hit his barrier, so he excitedly asked Ferner if there was some kind of curse on the boulder. True, he didn't answer him. The wolf only looked piercingly at the black-haired guy. Tenno was fascinated by the fluffy and cute animal. However, his affection for the wolf stopped when the black boulder attacked him again. The only reason the boulder couldn't hurt them was because of the barrier the boy had set up. However, the boulder continued to try to attack them, but the barrier prevented it from doing so. Tenno looked at the boulder. The boy thought that it was alive. Then he also noticed Fenrir growling. The white wolf's behavior was similar to how it was when they first met. Tenno then used purification magic on the boulder. Although the purification magic was used on the stone, nothing changed. The Tenno realized that the spell had not worked. The curse was too strong, or conversely, his purification was too weak. Therefore, the black-haired boy thought about increasing the power of the purification spell on this stone even more. Until now, he had imagined the process of getting rid of the curse, just as they usually showed in the movies, but he knew that it would not work on solid rock. Then he should have imagined the curse of darkness as something more persistent, something that could not be easily removed. Tenno wanted to make it so that the curse on the stone would slowly peel away and disappear forever. After thinking, the guy began to use a cleansing spell on the boulder. After a while, the curse began to leave the boulder, namely, it was torn off it like a film. For a long time, the curse in the form of a film was torn off the boulder and disappeared forever. And finally, a bird appeared to them. It turned out that it was the bird that was under such a great influence of darkness. Tenno, seeing the bird, was in shock. Soon, the little bird came to its senses. It recovered from so much darkness. Standing on its feet, the bird began to flap its wings. Then she flew towards Tenno. The guy managed to put his hand out for her to land on. He began to look at her and noticed with horror that she was wounded. Regenerating the wounds was difficult, but the boy wanted to do it. First, Tenno wanted to heal her diseased cells, and then heal the wound. Then the boy used healing and cleaning spells on the bird. At that very moment, all the dirt and wounds disappeared from the bird's small body. The boy appreciated the magnificent appearance of the cute bird. However, its size, in his opinion, was unfortunate. The bird was unhappy with the guy's last comment about her body size. She began to peck his palm indignantly. Tenno apologized to the indignant bird. Then, as an apology, he gently stroked her small head. The bird also began to cuddle and enjoy his stroking. Tenno was touched by this sight. The guy immediately forgot about the recent pain. After the boy had finished clearing the boulder made of darkness, he thought about taking a short break to rest and gain strength. As Tenno rested, he looked at the walls. They glowed brightly due to the barrier he had created, protecting him and his other companions from the effects of the darkness. Too many things happened to the black-haired guy. He was a little confused by the whole situation and did not understand anything. Then, loud banging sounds were heard in the cave. The wolves became alert and stood next to the barrier. It turns out that this black darkness is trying to get through the Tenno barrier. More and more darkness was trying to break through the barrier to all living things to affect everyone. Tenno was a little worried that his barrier wouldn't be able to handle the darkness. So the boy silently watched as the darkness tried to destroy the barrier. However, the barrier was strong and did not allow the darkness to get through it. Tenno, seeing this, calmed down and turned the other way. He wanted to think about the magical power that had appeared in him later. At the moment, everything seemed safe. The barrier he created protected them well from the curse of darkness. But the boy was puzzled by something. He was interested in one thing. Namely, he noticed with great surprise that the pack of wolves began to look more cheerful than before. The animals were relaxed and looked simply wonderful. Tenno was worried about this. After all, he had not seen the wolf pack eat anything. Before this, they were all quite sluggish and tired. However, the boy did not think about it for too long. No matter how much he thought about it, he simply would not understand anything. At the moment, he needed to think about the most important thing, namely a safe place to stay, water and food. In order for them to survive, he had to think about basic needs. Tenno was still alive, so he made the decision to definitely get out of this place. He wouldn't lose just because he got into trouble. The boy noticed that the cave was suitable for a safe overnight stay. If he could clear this place, they could spend the night in this place. But first, he needed to do something about the black shadow. The blows to the barrier continued to rain down, the darkness trying to break through without stopping. Tenno realized that if the barrier was reacting, it meant that the darkness was leaking from somewhere. Seeing this, he felt a certain uneasiness in his soul. Tenno decided that he urgently needed to do something about this. The guy, having used magic all these days, also noticed that he would not be able to perform the purification if he did not know where he was. First, he needed to fully explore the cave to clear it, but Tenno didn't know if he could use magic to solve this problem. He tried using a terrain study spell. A faint image of the forest area appeared before him, but Tenno found it difficult to study the area, because the dark shadow thickly enveloped it. If he could only look from the other side, he might be able to do something. Because of the thick dark shadow, he could not check what was outside. The guy was very puzzled by the problem that arose with studying the area. Then the idea came to him that he could use the gift of clairvoyance. What Tenno wanted was magic that would allow him to see everything from different angles. Namely, something that would help him look freely from above. With this idea, only one answer came to his mind in the form of a drone. Tenno realized that in order to study the area, he should imagine a drone spell. The guy once saw a beautiful crimson sunset and a canyon on TV, filmed with a drone. It was an impressive view for him. Then Tenno began to think about the clairvoyance spell in the form of a drone with great enthusiasm. At that moment, a system unit appeared in front of the guy. Tenno was delighted by this. He succeeded, his idea came true. A monitor appeared in front of him, showing him a full view of the entire forest area. Darkness thickly enveloped the forest, and a mountain with a flat top was included in it. Tenno realized that they were currently on a rather large mountain. He also noticed the entrance through which he had entered this cave. It looked very small on the mountain. Now all he had to do was imagine how he would cover this place with a dome in the form of a barrier and carry out cleansing from the darkness. The boy also remembered that there was a spell that would banish the curse. He wondered about the possibility that by clearing the dark shadow, the curse would disappear from that place. He liked the possibility of the darkness disappearing from these lands. Then the guy used a purification spell. At that moment, the monitor showed how all the darkness on the mountain completely disappeared. The next moment, Tenno quickly erected a barrier over the area so that the darkness could not reappear on the mountain. A bright light blinded everyone for a moment. The animals were dumbfounded by all the actions of the guy. Tenno felt something coming out of his body. Namely, it was magic that was overflowing him. The darkness began to disappear from every corner of the area with lightning speed. The barrier was shining brightly above the area. Now the area was completely cleared of the curse of darkness. The shadows disappeared from the area. All nature was shining brightly and fragrant from the disappearance of darkness. The guy happily watched this from his monitor. At the same time, a pack of wolves looked at their cleared and calm forest in surprise. An hour later, Tenno was very upset about something. He was in an irritated state because the widow's darkness appeared in the area, even though he had erected a barrier. Then the guy noticed that the dark shadow was coming out of something. Namely, the darkness appeared in this area not from above, but from underground. Tenno was stunned by this information because then the barrier he erected was useless. However, he immediately came to his senses. The angry guy was irritated by the whole situation with the darkness. He needed to use magic again. Then the guy increased the radius and depth of the barrier so that it could penetrate to the ground. All this was so that the darkness would definitely not appear in this area. The boy was determined against the darkness. He would do everything to drive away the darkness and make it go away from the forest. Then the boy used purification magic again with great force. Tenno then also cast a barrier spell. The next moment, a bright light illuminated the entire area and the barrier appeared over the area again. Now that a certain area of the forest was completely cleared and protected from the darkness at its curse, Tenno sat down tiredly on the stone floor. Physically, he was fine, but mentally, the guy was in a complete wreck. He was tired from using a lot of magic. Tenno noticed with an awkward smile that his hands were shaking from fatigue. He leaned on his hands tiredly. The boy did not understand what to do and how to be in this situation, he just wanted to go back to his world. But he was distracted from his sad thoughts by the approaching wolf. Fenrir lay down on the boy's knee as a support. Tenno asked with a tired laugh if he really was a wild animal. Tenno knew that he couldn't do anything about the situation that had happened to him. No matter how much he thought about it, he shouldn't be sad. He hoped that his magic had worked and cleansed the mountain. He also noticed that after meeting the wolf, he had changed a lot. Meanwhile, in another place, it was deep night. 2 moons were shining brightly in the sky. The inhabitants of the kingdom were quietly sleeping. Only in the royal palace something unexpected happened. In the room, there was an uncut dark stone, shining brightly and also hovering in the air. Suddenly, a small crack appeared on it. The next morning, a subordinate informed the king that something strange had happened to the king of the forest, Fenrir. The man, sitting on his throne, arrogantly expected good news about the king of the forest. The subordinate continued speaking. It turns out that a glow was seen in the central part of the forest, which affected most of the land. The king smirked arrogantly at the news he heard. He thought that the glow meant the last moment of the king of the forest and his kin. Then the man with the crown ordered his subordinate to bring more gifts to the devil's stone. He immediately obeyed the order of his king. The king was beside himself with the news of the destruction of the king of the forest. He only had a little more time before he could make the world his own, including this forest. The king looked out the window with a dark look. Soon the monsters that had been sleeping all this time would awaken. Therefore, he needed more sacrifices of lives for the sake of the Unpera's kingdom. The lifeless bodies of the beast race people lay in the room with the dark stone. The devil stone instantly absorbed their life force into itself. With the help of life force, the devil stone used its power. Meanwhile, in another kingdom, in the royal palace, something was happening. The beast king learned from his subordinate that something was happening in the forest. There had been no strange things there for the past 10 years, and only now had something happened. The man was surprised by this. He knew that the kingdom of Enperas had cast a complex cursed eye spell on this forest. Many sacred beasts had been destroyed and the forest was shrouded in dark energy. During these 200 years, several countries bordering the forest were also destroyed, and Enperas sacrificed tens of thousands of lives for its defense. The subordinate, hearing the words of his king, told him that he would not give in to fear. The king understood that only humans were capable of such cruel actions. If their race took over the world, then their kingdom of Entor would also be destroyed. The realization of this made the beast raceman feel heavy. He prayed to God in his thoughts to save them from this disaster. Meanwhile, in the forest on the mountain, a black-haired boy woke up. Tenno came out of the cave. The boy looked at the clear sky, and immediately his mood rose. A joyful pack of wolves gathered around him. Fenrir had also just woken up. Tenno was attracted by Fenrir's actions. He looked at the white wolf for a long time. The boy wondered where the wolf pack would go after this forest was cleared. But then Tenno called out to the silver wolf. Fenrir immediately turned towards the boy. Tenno asked the leader of the wolf pack if they wanted to come with him. Fenrir, hearing the boy's question, stared at him for a moment with his long and intent gaze. Tenno thought with a smile that the silver wolf did not understand anything. Even though the wolf didn't understand him, the boy wanted to give them names. First, he named the silver wolf he met first. Tenno named him Cal. Then he gave names to those who also had the same silver fur as Cal. He named the she-wolf Soa and the wolf Hio. Next came those with white and black fur. They were both male. Tenno named the black-haired wolf Shion and the white-haired Kuro. The only one left was the one that didn't look like a normal wolf but more like a cross between a dog. The guy named him T. After the boy had given out names to all the wolf pack with T, his attention was drawn to the remaining small bird. Tenno named it Karen. After all, it had beautiful wings and a cute chirp. The boy was proud of himself. He thought he was good at coming up with names. Tenno remembered that his sister didn't think so. However, he didn't want to think about it. Karen was happily chirping at having her own name. Then the boy interrupted his thoughts. He should return to reality. Fenrir watched the black-haired boy in silence. The silver wolf was overjoyed that the Tenno had given him a name. In reality, they were not wolves but beasts called Fenrils. The Fenril subordinates asked their king about the man's identity. They wanted to know how he was able to give them names. The Fenril pack was stunned by this knowledge. As far as Kao knew, there had never been such a thing in the entire history of Fenril. Namely, accepting this man who wielded the magic of banishing evil and healing as a master. In truth, the Fenril pack had become his debtors after the Tenno saved them. Their magic had also begun to recover. Kao's subordinates also noticed this. Kao continued to speak. Therefore, because of everything, they, the Fenrir, will obey the Tenno as their master. Then the silver Fenrir turned towards Daolf. Ko wanted to know Chai's opinion on this decision, since he was not a Fenrir. Daolf had been allowed to take refuge in their shelter, so he did not want to give up on this decision. T was of Daolf's race. Tenno mistook him for a dog. Then Kao made a decision. Now, to repay the boy for everything, they will devote themselves to serving the master. At the same time, Tenno turned to Koa. He needed to find a place with water, but the boy suddenly stopped talking. To his surprise, the whole pack of wolves was looking at him with a piercing gaze, which made the guy feel a little awkward for a moment. He awkwardly repeated to them again that he wanted to find a place with water. Shion and Kuro were very enthusiastic about taking their master to the place with water. They were very eager to serve their master. Tenno was stunned by this. Meanwhile, Kuro and Shion were already far away from him, so the boy had to immediately go down the mountain to catch up with them. The black-haired boy was scared to go down the mountain like that. He ran down the slope screaming. His screams made one Fenrir get worried and run after the boy. Soon they all came down from the mountain and found themselves among the trees. The Fenrils did not stop for a minute because they really wanted to show the boy a place with water. Tenno was stunned that they even went beyond the barrier, but did not reach the designated place yet. After a while, the guy found himself right in front of a place with water. However, upon seeing it, Tenno immediately became gloomy. He was in deep shock from the sight of the place. After all, the water was polluted and the darkness affected the area. The water was bubbling loudly from the pollution and darkness. Steam was coming from it. Tenno was stunned. The sight of the water depressed him. This was not what he thought. The boy wanted to tell Kuro and Shion that there was a problem with the water and that this was not the place he wanted, but he was stopped by their waiting faces. Tenno wanted to continue. He said that even if purification was used, however, the boy stopped again. After all, he was not allowed to tell the sad news by the waiting faces of the Fenrils. Shion and Kuro patiently and sweetly waited for Tenno's praise. The black-haired boy was amazed by their sweet actions. The boy then patted the heads of the Fenrils, stuttering a bit. He also praised Kuro and Shion for their help and for answering him in his place. The guy smiled, but tears appeared in his eyes from the whole depressing situation. After all, if he did not replenish his strength, he would not endure. At that moment, the silver wolf rushed in. He also wanted to receive praise from the black-haired boy. Tenno could only praise everyone once again. After some time, the whole flock of Fenrils and Chai were with the guy. Tenno was dragging himself along the ground tiredly. The exhausted guy sadly apologized to them because he would not be able to drink that water. It would be good if the spring water was also inside the barrier. The guy was exhausted. He really wanted to drink clean water. Tenno thought sadly about water. He was thirsty. At that moment, a warm light appeared on his palm and water appeared from his palm. It turns out that the guy summoned water with magic. As soon as he imagined water, it appeared. In his palm, water was calmly sitting. Tenno was glad that he had magic. Then the guy also had the idea that if he wanted to eat a lot, then food would appear too. The boy wanted to know about it, so he immediately tried to summon gyudon with egg and soy sauce. Tenno was inspired by this and wanted to eat this dish well. However, the magic failed to form the dish he had envisioned. There was a moment of silence. The Fenrils looked questioningly at the boy's actions. Tenno coughed with an embarrassed blush. Then he quickly changed the subject, so it was impossible to summon a restaurant dish. Then the boy had another idea about summoning. This time he wanted to try summoning ingredients. Then Tenno loudly shouted the word cabbage. But nothing happened. The cabbage didn't appear, which made Tenno feel awkward. The animals continued to look questioningly at the black-haired guy. They didn't understand what he was doing. However, the boy did not stop there. Tenno also tried to summon ingredients such as chicken wing, apple. However, nothing happened again. The food did not appear in front of him, because of which Tenno sat down on the ground tiredly and irritated. Calling for food was useless. Then the thought came to him that he couldn't create things that didn't exist in this world, so the guy sadly had no choice but to try and find food in this place. Tenno took that mountain as a landmark so as not to get lost in the forest. The boy wanted to look around the area in search of food. It would be good for him if he came across some fruit trees along the way. As the boy walked through the forest, he came across mushrooms along the way. However, Tenno did not want to take risks with the mushrooms and did not try them. The search for food continued. He, along with the pack of other animals, looked for food for themselves. The guy carefully examined the trees he came across, but he did not see a single fruit tree. There were no flowers, no fruits. In this forest, he saw only ordinary trees. Tenno sighed tiredly. He had found nothing in the area, only wasted his strength and became hungry, but suddenly he was pushed from behind by a silver wolf subordinate of Ko. He tried to get his attention. Tenno was stunned by the blow from Hyo. The boy looked at the wolf with sadness and questioning. Meanwhile, Kuro, Shion, and Hyo looked at each other and made a decision. Then, the three of them quickly headed somewhere. Tenno was stunned by their actions. He didn't understand where they ran off to. However, the wolves disappeared from his sight in a flash. The guy could only look in their direction with a puzzled look. He then turned to Koa, pointing to the fleeing wolves. However, Fenrir only howled soothingly and did not show any sad emotions. The boy calmed down immediately. He was delighted with Kao's actions. Although his howl sounded impressive, Tenno still didn't understand anything. Kao stared at the black-haired boy. Tenno thought that the silver wolf had finally started thinking about his own kind. So the boy tried to calm the silver wolf down. He told Kao that they would be back soon. In the meantime, they would look for some more provisions. Tenno was worried about the three wolves that had escaped. He hoped that they would return to them. Then, he and the remaining pack of wolves set out to find food. There were still huge trees around. The boy was annoyed. His stomach growled loudly from hunger. Tenno was very hungry. This was bad because the boy had not found any food yet. He didn't know what to do. After all, there were no flowers or fruits in this world. Tenno was thinking about how to survive and find food in this world. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to something. The boy noticed something next to them. Namely, he found a new cave. Tenno was happy about this event. He looked at the discovered place with a lively look. The boy also noticed that the previous cave was cramped, and the exit was also very narrow. He thought that the new cave he had found was a good place to camp. Tenno told Kao this. He then happily reminded himself that he should have been careful when entering the cave. Tenno first used magic and scanned the cave space with it. He looked at the cave with delight. It was very spacious. Then the boy noticed that inside the cave there was also a passage to the top. Its height was about 2 or 3 floors. Tenno was completely engrossed in looking at the space of this cave. Suddenly he felt something. The guy instantly stopped using clairvoyance magic. After all, in front of him was a defeated huge demonic boar, and next to the monster were joyful Shion, Koru, and Hyo. Tenno was stunned by the sight he saw. The boy screamed for a moment in surprise. A huge defeated boar, soaked in darkness, lay in front of him. Tenno then realized that the 3 wolves had gone hunting. Shion, Koru, and Hyo all howled happily, agreeing with the boy's words. Tenno was delighted by this cute picture. After all, the 3 were very cute. Then the guy turned his attention to the prey they had caught. The terrifying sight of the boar did not increase Tenno's appetite. The guy was horrified by the food offered to him. However, he could not refuse the 3 wolves. After all, they went hunting for him and brought him prey. The guy was defeated by their actions. He had no choice but to eat the boar. Hyo, with a cute face, expected praise from the boy. Tenno was even more touched by this. Then he grabbed all 3 of them in his tight embrace. Shion, Koru, and Hyo enjoyed his caresses. Although the guy was also happy that he was petting the wolves, he understood that he would have to cut up the meat of the demonic boar. After the boy praised the trio, he began to cut up the boar cape. To begin, Tenno applied a full-fledged darkness purification to the prey. In order for the darkness to completely disappear from the monster, he imagined the purification as a vacuum cleaner. Tenno continued to cast the cleansing spell on the demonic boar's body. However, there was a lot of darkness. Therefore, due to the difficulty of cleansing, he simply dispelled everything that was imbued with the curse. The next moment, all the darkness with the curse evaporated and disappeared from the demonic boar's body. The guy sighed tiredly and proceeded to the next action. He prepared the most delicious ingredients for his dish. The meat of the prey was completely cleansed of the curse, causing it to shine deliciously. The 3 wolves began to salivate at the delicious sight of the prey. They were delighted with the Tenno. Then the boy approached the prey. He noticed that it looked like a boar, but was clearly a magical beast. At this thought, the boy thought of his companions. He thought for a moment that they, too, had magic. Hyo was drooling over the delicious-looking boar, so the cute and stupid look of the Fenrir convinced the guy otherwise. He thought that they were unlikely to have magical powers, since they were just normal, cute wolves. Therefore, Tenno thought that he was most likely mistaken. Then he saw how the wolves looked at the boar with anticipation, and thought that they would rather gnaw the meat raw, and that meant that he would have to cut up the boar himself. The guy was not happy about that. Then he saw one of the wolves looking at him expectantly. Tenno had to tell Hyo again that he would eat the meat with great pleasure. After that, he turned his gaze back to the cleaned boar. The guy didn't know where to start in cutting up the cape. Tenno tried to calm himself down. He needed time to think about everything. In the meantime, so that the meat wouldn't go to waste, the guy should freeze it. Tenno, thinking about freezing, remembered that in his world he had high-grade strawberries in his refrigerator that he bought with his salary. The guy was sad that he would not be able to try them. Then he used freezing magic on the prey. At that very moment, the boar's entire huge body was frozen. Cold steam came from the monster. The wolves were surprised by this. They looked at the frozen meat with questioning glances. Tenno sighed with relief. He had managed to deal with the freezing. Now all he had to do was drain the internal fluids from the prey. Just at this thought, the guy was seized by a strong tremor. His whole body was shaking with horror. He understood that he would not be able to do it. And then it came to him to use magic in this matter. He wanted to try to imagine that biological fluids were just water. However, if he did so, there was a chance that the meat would become completely dried out. Therefore, Tenno wanted to check what was inside the boar using magic. The internal appearance of the prey was unpleasant for Tenno. Because of this, the boy's legs weakened for a moment. Tenno dropped to all fours. He was defeated by the picture he saw inside the boar. The animals were worried about their master's actions. They thought that he didn't like the meat he brought. After all, he froze the meat, and for them it was tastier to bite into the still warm meat. The three wolves looked at the boy with a sad expression. After all, they had not been able to serve him well. Tenno was thinking about how to drain the liquids from the meat. The boy came up with the idea of cutting the blood vessels near the organs. He then decided to move all the blood vessels outside and burn them. Tenno wanted to try this. The boy tried to fulfill his plan with the help of magic. One of the wolves thought that their master had no fangs, so he could not eat meat. Hio, Shion, and Kuro wanted the master to order them, and then they would tear the meat for him. Meanwhile, Tenno used teleportation magic. At that very moment, all the blood vessels of the prey were outside. The three wolves immediately began to salivate at their appetizing appearance. However, much to their horror, the Tenno destroyed all of the prey's blood vessels with magical flames. The Fenrils were stunned by this. They stared at their master in silence, their eyes wide open. Tenno noticed that the flames had burned the meat slightly on top. But the guy could clean it up in no time with a scrub. Now all he had to do was pull out the inside of the boar and wash it all out. Tenno had cut up fish before, but he didn't know which parts of the animal needed to be removed when cutting it up. The boy began mentally listing all the internal organs of the animal. So because of this, he felt sick for a moment. The guy immediately stopped thinking about the image of organs. Then, Tenno used teleportation magic. The next moment, the entire inside of the boar was teleported outside. The wolves smelled its delicious aroma. Their saliva began to flow again from the delicious sight of the inside of the prey. But at that very moment, the boy used flame magic again and destroyed the entire inside of the boar. The wolves were again horrified by this scene. Tenno didn't like the smell of everything. Although he managed to destroy the parts of the prey that were unnecessary for him, the guy was not pleased with its smell and appearance. He decided to do everything with his eyes closed next time. The wolves were stunned. Tenno then realized that he could not only cool things, but also burn them, which meant he could try using elemental magic. Now the boy wanted to start cutting up the cape, so he wanted the wolves to move away from him a little. Tenno, turning to them, noticed that some were depressed about something. The boy then began cutting the meat. He used air magic to cut the meat with quick, sharp movements. The boar meat was easily cut into the parts he needed. All the guy had to do was cut off the skin from the meat he had received. Tenno then also chose a certain piece of meat for himself. He had to cook it well so that he could eat it. The boy then offered Cow and the others the rest of the spoils. Cow cheerfully gave permission to those who brought the spoils to choose their share first. Shion, Koru, and Hio ran towards the meat with delight. Then a Daelf named Chai approached the king of Fenril. Chai asked Kal that after the Fenril had divided the spoils among themselves, he should also give him some. Kal agreed to Chai's request to share meat with him. Until he left his pack, they would help him in any way they could. For at the moment they were in the same position. Chai praised Kal. He was truly a wise ruler. Then the king of Fenrils reminded Chai that he too was the king of Daelf. But T didn't think so. After all, he couldn't be called a king. After all, he couldn't protect his comrades. It would be very good if he could find the surviving Daelfs. Then the wolf also reminded the Daelf that he too had received a name from the Tenno. Now they would call him by the name Chai. Chai was happy with this news. Suddenly, someone screamed. It turned out that the guy had gotten burned. His flesh had completely burned off, which made Tenno look at his palms with a gloomy expression. Then the boy sheepishly asked one of the wolves to share some meat with him. Tenno was sad about the lost meat. Last time, he also incinerated the inside of the boar. This time, he would try to put the meat on a stone. So the black-haired boy tried to imagine that the stone was a grill. He tried to use heat magic with great caution. And little by little, the meat began to cook slowly on the stone. Its delicious aroma began to unfold in all its glory. Tenno was glad that the piece of meat was not incinerated by his magic. The wolves were engrossed in devouring the prey. They bit into the meat and enjoyed the meal. Suddenly, a delicious aroma appeared in the air, which caused the entire flock of Fenril to stop eating meat. They had never smelled such a delicious aroma of food before. Soon, they all found themselves right in front of the guy who was preparing his piece of meat. The meat looked completely cooked. Appetizing steam was floating from the dish. Tenno was glad, because putting the meat on the stone was the right decision. The meat was already well cooked. Meanwhile, the wolves were looking at the delicious piece of meat with drooling mouths. Then the guy stopped frying the meat and grabbed a wooden stick with a sharp end. Tenno skewered the cooked meat onto a stick. The meat was still hot from being grilled like a grill. Even though he tried to cook it well, it was still a bit tough. Then Tenno also noticed that the dish was a little burnt. However, he was not upset about it. The guy wanted to try the food as soon as possible. Then, after tasting the cooked meat, Tenno noticed with pleasure that it was very tasty. He was glad that he was able to satisfy his hunger. Then the boy continued eating. Tenno tried to refuse the bird, because it was not allowed to eat it. Not far from the company, there was a cave. Dark energy was floating in this cave. Due to the humidity, drops of water were dripping onto the ground. Someone was silently listening to the noise coming from outside. Meanwhile, Tenno was stunned to find that his little bird was a mammal, eating boar meat with ease. After they had eaten their fill, the boy and the pack of animals began to explore the new place for safety. In the cave, both above and below, Tenno found no problems. He also found no signs of habitation. Tenno wanted to make the main room at the very top of this cave. The current place was like a 4-story villa compared to the previous dwelling. At the moment, they were on the lower floor of the cave. The guy was delighted because the place was spacious and also the ceiling of the room was high. The guy noticed that there would be even more space further on. He was also curious about what was shining in the wall in the distance. However, he did not feel the presence of living beings. On this floor, everything was fine as well. Tenno was only worried about the lower floor. After checking again with his clairvoyance skill, he noticed that there seemed to be something down there. Tenno immediately became serious. He was wondering how long the barrier he had cast earlier would last. Even though he had cast a spell, he thought that the darkness would appear again, sooner or later. The boy sighed tiredly. In any case, he should have checked what was going on downstairs first. Tenno didn't really want to go down. Out of sadness, he hugged Cow. Cow tried to calm the boy down. Tenno was glad for his support. He thanked the silver wolf for his help. Now he felt better. Then the calmed down Tenno headed towards the lower floor. The boy, along with the pack of wolves, headed down tensely. Along the way, Tenno had to be careful not to trip over the rocks. Finally, they reached the bottom floor of the cave. Cow, sensing something, immediately showed his grin. After all, a thick darkness appeared before them. Tenno was stunned by the sight before him. Even after his massive purification, there was still so much cursed dark energy left. Fenril growled at the sight of the darkness. The wolf pack and the boy looked tensely towards the dark energy cluster. Then, a smaller dark energy cluster began to emerge from the dark cluster. Then, unexpectedly for everyone, she quickly moved in their direction. The Fenrils immediately growled, trying to protect their master. Tenno, frightened, immediately used a purification spell. However, the darkness did not disappear. Dark energy tried to forcefully break through the protective barrier. The guy saw that the barrier reacted. For a moment, he thought that his purification magic had failed. But at that moment, the dark energy quickly disappeared. Tenno was stunned by this. But then a dull thud of something falling was heard in the room. The guy was still in a state of shock that his cleaning magic had worked, albeit late. And now the clot of dark energy was gone. The black-haired guy, turning his head in all directions, tried to find something. After all, the same thing happened to Karen, so he thought that someone might appear from the darkness. Tenno looked down and saw a spider. The boy had to bend down to the floor to see the spider. Tenno looked at the arachnid in amazement. It looked like a spider, but it also had wings. Then the boy noticed a cloud of dark energy nearby. Tenno immediately used his purification magic. At that moment, the purification magic made the dark energy disappear. The spider was stunned at the sight of this, that a human could destroy the darkness. The guy noticed that the dark energy was trying hard to get out from under the ground. During the cleansing, the darkness began to evaporate from the room. And finally, one large spider and 20 babies emerged from the dark clot. Tenno was surprised that in this world, beetles were a type of magical monster, although a spider could not be called a beetle. But they also had wings, so they might not be spiders. Tenno became thoughtful at this thought. He could not find an answer to this question. Suddenly, the silver wolf headed towards the magical spiders. Kao noticed that only one large representative of this species remained alive. Tenno looked at Kao in surprise. Then, the spider with wings flapped them and flew up. It headed towards the black-haired boy. Tenno was scared for a moment by this. The spider with wings flew up and landed right on the top of the boy's head. Tenno, although uneasy about it, did not try to drive the spider off his head. At the same time, the little spiderlings also moved forward. They jumped onto one of the wolves with ease, and Shion was stunned to see the spiders climbing onto his fur. The black wolf, twisting its body in all directions, tried to remove the small spiderlings from itself. Tenno was stunned by this scene. However, the boy understood that they seemed not to be enemies for them. After a while, they had already climbed to the second floor. The guy noticed that this one was also quite spacious. Now they only had to check every corner of the room. Tenno remembered that earlier he had only cast a spell, and it had already been activated, although he had no idea what it was. He remembered his sister saying that when using magic it was important to have an image in your head. Apparently in practice it was different. The guy wanted to test his theory again. He tried to summon fire, but without an image of it in his head. However, nothing happened. The flame did not appear on his palm. Tenno tried to imagine nothing again, but this time he used water summoning magic. The next moment, a splashing sound was heard. There was a puddle of water behind the boy. Seeing this, Tenno immediately thought about it. After a while, he tried to imagine the image of what he wanted to summon, and the next moment a flame appeared on his palm. The wolves were stunned to see their master burning. Tenno didn't understand what was different from when he summoned water. Then he summoned fire again. The fire appeared. The guy noticed that the flame could be made to float in the air. Most likely, using the new magic, he needed to imagine a clear image. Then, if the image and the spell were linked once, it would be fixed in his head, and he could only pronounce the words to summon the elements. This was very convenient, since Tenno was very tired when constantly concentrating. Suddenly the flame moved to the side. This is what the black-haired guy noticed. Tenno realized that the wind was blowing from the crack, and because of this, the flame changed direction. Tenno tried to look through the crack and see what was inside it, but even though it was wide, there was no dark energy there. Also, the guy could not see anything because of this. At that moment, he had the idea to illuminate the crack with a ball of fire. However, when he carried out this idea, the flame illuminated everything too brightly, because of which everyone was momentarily blinded by such a bright light. Tenno realized he had overdone the lighting a bit. He was touched by the way the wolves had cutely covered their eyes. The boy apologized to them with a smile. Then he tried to make the fireball smaller with great effort. This time, the fireball was too small. Tenno had to make it a little brighter again. After the boy did this, he fell tiredly to the floor. Using precise magic, Tenno was getting very tired. Then the boy noticed how the wolves around him were watching them with excitement and anxiety. After some time of rest, Tenno looked inside the crack. With the help of the fireball, he could see that there were some sparkling stones inside. Suddenly, a spider with wings flew up and entered right into the crack. Then it grabbed a small piece of sparkling stone and headed back. The spider flew up, climbed onto the boy's palm, and placed the sparkling stone right there. Tenno was delighted by the beauty of the silver stone. Then he sincerely thanked the spider with wings for bringing him the sparkling stone. Tenno also called him the leader of spiders. The spider looked at the boy silently. And then he hid in Tenno's hair, embarrassed. The boy watched this with surprise. Somehow it happened that the boy called him the head of the spiders. Suddenly, the boy noticed that the wolves were staring at the crystal in his palm. He thought that it was a rare stone. Although the stone was beautiful, this was not the time to use it. Tenno put it in his pocket. The boy then thought about the possibility of finding something sparkling like this stone on the upper floors. But he wanted to deal with that later. The Fenrils were stunned that Tenno could look at Misril so calmly. Then the guy, after checking, realized that there were no other cracks and spaces. Then the inspection of the mountain was over. After a while, the boy looked at the things in his bag. He only had a wallet and some papers. Tenno was disappointed by this. He thought he would have something useful. His phone was already lost somewhere. After inspecting the new home, Tenno planned to look for other people. He also needed to find something to sleep on. If he sleeps on the floor, his body will hurt. Tenno needed to find something soft and smooth. Then the guy looked at something in surprise. It turns out that with his magic, he was able to polish the floor. The wolf pack looked at this with surprise. Tenno was momentarily embarrassed by this attention. Then he enthusiastically made the walls and floors smooth. The Fenreals were stunned by the scene they saw. Their master was incredible. Magic was able to turn a solid mountain into this. Cal happily praised the boy, his place to sleep will be here. However, the others got ahead of him and ran in that direction. Because the floor was too smooth, the wolves slipped and almost fell. Tenno looked at this with embarrassment. Cal was embarrassed because he had made himself look bad. Precision magic was truly a difficult thing. The dark energy tried to break through the barrier. However, the barrier performed its protective function well. It only showed a reaction to the blows of darkness. A spider with wings watched this from afar. They are the masters of hellfire. Spiders with wings withstood the flames well. Coming out from the depths of the earth, they dragged their prey into the lava. Their clan kept everyone in fear. Those who saw them were doomed to be eliminated. The guardians of the destruction of Tujiarni was what the winged spiders were called before. Only one adult of this species survived. At this point, they were just small spiders with wings. This was their reduced form. To protect their offspring, they used up almost all of their magical powers. They were very lucky to survive in such a state. However, the spider with wings was wondering why he had not disappeared under the influence of strong magic. Suddenly, someone called out to him, calling him Tijurini. It was the king of Fenral. The silver wolf realized that it was Tiarenia after all. He smirked and pointed out to the spider that he had become very small compared to his previous self. Tiarenia was annoyed by Fenral's words. Giarini wanted to know what had happened. After all, the smell of evil magic had spread throughout the forest, and now she had disappeared somewhere. The spider also wanted to know if Tenno was really human. Fenral agreed, Tenno was human, however, it was the power of this human that saved them all. But Tiarene did not believe it, because it was humans who destroyed the forest. But the Tenno magic was different from that, so their clan unanimously decided to proclaim him master. Spider was surprised, because they were proud Fenrils. Then Cow told Terani that although they had never been enemies with them, if they decided to attack their master, a terrible roar sounded in the forest. But the spider didn't even think about it. Even if they were 100 times stronger, the guy would still be stronger than them. Moreover, it was immediately clear to them that his magic was good and restored everything. Cow immediately calmed down. However, this did not mean that the Fenral would no longer be the masters of the forest. Chiarini was irritated by Cow's words. Cow joked. Then he told Tajerani to stop his cubs from tormenting Daolf. T, after they had defeated him, was trembling and depressed. Chiarini was surprised that Daolf was named Che. Then Fenril happily explained to him that their master had given them names. From now on, Chiarini should call him Koa. Cow was proud of the name. Tajerani remembered that the boy had called him a spider earlier. He was also embarrassedly happy about the name. Then the spider asked Koa about the lightning. He felt an incredibly terrifying magic. Koa thought that most likely people were fighting somewhere again, so the master erected a barrier. The spider was shocked that the guy created the barrier himself. After all, the barrier was very high. At this rate, the guy should have been destroyed from exhaustion. Cow wouldn't have been able to hold out for that long either, but the owner was fine. The spider was in disbelief about this. Tenno was thinking hard about something. Tenno realized that there were no people in this area. He had sent a drone to survey the area in the past few days, but there was only forest around. The forest was quite large. The guy found a lot of animals, but he didn't find a single house in this place. Wherever he looked, there was only forest. Then, for a moment, Tenno thought that there were no more people in this world. The boy tried to deny this thought. After all, there were places he had not explored. After a while, he calmed down. His mood improved after he had arranged the dwelling. After practicing, he was able to make a normal floor and walls. Tenno also made stairs connecting the floors. Thanks to this, he honed his movement skills. Although it was an ordinary mountain from the outside, there were passages from top to bottom. Inside, there was now a real villa. The housing complex consisted of 4 floors and 2 basements. The 4th floor was his bedroom. The first basement was adapted for a food warehouse, and on the second there was a cave with stones. Unfortunately, no one will understand his efforts. The wolves, wagging their tails, patiently waited for the boy's praise. They brought food. Tenno chose a piece of meat and used movement magic to teleport it to a wooden board. The flock of Fenral then began to eat the rest of the prey. Lately, they had been competing to eat the insides of the prey. The boy realized that the Inuit and the animals ate raw meat, so he shouldn't have fried the food. Tenno remembered how the wolves excitedly grabbed the inside of the kill and ran away from the boy so he couldn't incinerate the food. Tenno was frying meat. However, the boy was already tired of eating it every day. He really wanted to eat fish. Suddenly, his attention was drawn to a silver wolf. Cow stopped eating his prey and looked somewhere with tension. The silver wolf was looking at something with a menacing grin. A threatening growl came from its mouth. The boy was worried about the change in Cow. As he approached the wolf, he realized that the dark energy had managed to break through the barrier. The boy noticed how the spiders were ready. The wolves were tense and expected an attack from the darkness. Tenno was angry about the situation. He remembered that lightning had been appearing on the barrier since last night. The boy was very annoyed. Hyul was stunned by the angry shout of his master. He looked at his master in fear. Tenno tried to regain his composure. Then, calming down, the boy looked down from the top of the mountain. Using magic, he launched the drone. A monitor appeared with a view of a section of the forest. Tenno saw that part of the forest had already been captured. When he was looking around yesterday, he noticed a lake outside the barrier. The boy found its exact location. Then he wanted to try to cleanse the entire area and also further strengthen the barrier. Cow was stunned by what his master wanted to do. However, Tenno would not know if he could do it without trying. While he was setting up the house, he had become accustomed to using magic. All he could do was imagine a strip that stretched all the way to the lake. Even though it was a long distance away, Tenno felt he could do it. The boy then used purification magic to the source of the darkness. The Fenral King was shocked and worried that his master was using too much magic. The guy continued. He wanted to stretch the strip in all directions so that it would also go to the depths of the earth. In this way, he would destroy the darkness that appeared. The next moment, the boy cast a spell to strengthen the barrier and cleanse it. Fenral watched it with excitement. A bright light enveloped the space, destroying the dark energy. Soon, the land was cleared of darkness. Tenno was happy with his success. He was able to increase the barrier tenfold. The guy did not feel tired, he even felt better. The spider with wings noted that Tenno was indeed an inexhaustible source of magic. They would never defeat him. Kao agreed with that. The guy noticed that the curse had gotten into the water and was able to spread throughout the area, so he should have put a barrier in that place in the form of a filter. For safety, Tenno wanted to install a 3-layer water filter. Kao was stunned that the boy still had strength. After this, Tenno realized that there was someone out there who was casting all these curses. Until the curse was completely gone, Tenno decided to cleanse the land of it every day. Then the boy smiled and told the silver wolf that they would go fishing the next day. Meanwhile, in Inspera's castle. Inspera's was under protection. The black-haired man looked out the window. The street was still peaceful. Suddenly, Genmilze called out his name. It was the commander of the Knights of the 4th Squad, Esperanza, Miserost. Genmilze was the commander of the 1st Squad. The man noticed that Miserost had returned early. His task was easy. There was nothing special in the forest. Only monsters appeared occasionally as usual. Miserost was not worried about safety because this country is protected by the strongest barrier. However, Genmilze was not so calm. He was a little worried about the light that appeared in the forest. A few days ago, a beam of light appeared in the center of the forest, stretching in all directions. Using the magic stone, the king decided to check if the power came from the Lord of the Forest. No such changes had been noticed since their birth. They also did not know if the king had any followers. Genmilze was surprised that he was still so strong. Miserost was momentarily silent at his words. He then awkwardly reported that because of this, the number of people in intelligence had increased. But the man did not consider this a cause for concern. With the power of their king and mages, they could attack other kingdoms for centuries. All they needed was to believe in the king and fight for him. In addition, a powerful barrier protects against monsters from the outside. The knights will also be able to protect the country. Miserost then said goodbye to Genmilze. The man wanted to take a bath as soon as possible. However, Genmilze was still uneasy. The center of the world and forest is controlled by the magic of the two-faced eye. A magic stone is used to control it. Since ancient times, this stone has released a huge amount of magic. To analyze it, many magicians have suffered. Thanks to this, the king and the magicians were able to stop aging. Research has been going on for hundreds of years. They aged, but very slowly. When Genmilze was a child, he didn't think much about it. After all, their country could only maintain dominance because of this stone. On the way, the man met a crowd of people of the beast race on the street. They were trudging along the ground with empty eyes. They looked very shabby. At the bottom of their necks, they had a sign by which they were controlled. Genmilze, while he was in thought, reached this place. Behind the beast race people was an evil old man with a whip. He did not even consider the beast race people as people. The old man used the whip to hurry them along. Ganmilze asked the old man about how it was rare to see a large number of prisoners. The leader immediately came to his senses. He looked at the man respectfully. Ganmilze was just passing by. Then the old man told him with a smile that the number of captives had decreased significantly recently. It was all because of the donations. And fortunately for the old man, the number of victims is planned to increase even more. Ganmilze, hearing this, was not so happy about it. Suddenly, the commander of the 5th squad, Gamul, approached them. Among the commanders, he was the most obsessed with battle. Ganmilze did not like him very much. The man noticed that he had a new sword. It turns out that the king gave Gamul a new one. The sword was the same as their rulers. It had powerful magic. Gamul had just come to test it on the prisoners. The sword could suck the fluid out of the body completely. Ganmilze wanted to put him down. However, Gamul had already approached the crowd of captives. The old man excitedly informed him that these were captives specially selected for the ritual, but Gamul didn't care. The man had already swung his sword, and with one movement he had destroyed the captives. Then Gamul laughed loudly. He enjoyed this feeling. The old man could only helplessly endure the man's actions. Gamul was bored because the prisoners of Nick did not resist his attacks. Suddenly, a magician approached him. He explained to the man that in order to suck out the sword, it was necessary to activate the skill. At that moment, Gamul became interested. Ganmilze looked at this scene with horror. He realized that this country had gone mad. It was light outside. The guy was busy tying something to a rope. Soon his fishing rod was ready. Although it was not a fishing line, it should work. Cal looked at the guy's actions questioningly. Then the silver wolf approached the boy. Tenno explained to him that he was putting meat on the line. Then the boy swung his rod. He told Kao with a smile that if the fish was on the line, it could be caught. Meanwhile, Kuro grabbed the meat on the line. Kuro was eating a piece of meat with pleasure. The guy worriedly told him that he couldn't eat it. Xian also wanted to eat meat. After a while, they headed towards a place with water. The guy hoped that there would be fish in this place. However, he was in for a disappointment. After all, the lake was completely polluted. Because of this, the probability of fish existence in the lake was very low. Tenno was depressed about this. He had been walking to this place for so long that he had not even thought about it. Then the boy angrily cast purification magic on the lake. Frowning, he pointed his palm towards the water and cast purification magic. However, the purification effect was too weak. The curse did not disappear. His previous purification efforts were useless. Tenno knew that it would be much more difficult to cleanse the water of the curse. Next, he erected a barrier over the water. The guy wanted to isolate the lake from all sides, including the depths of the earth. Then he thought about an effective way to purify the water. Tenno could definitely stop the curse from spreading through the air, but the guy didn't know how to separate the water to extract only the curse. Nothing came to his mind. The guy was frustrated thinking about how he could solve the problem of water purification. He tried to imagine the curse as dirt, but it wasn't that. The boy stroked Kao's fur thoughtfully. Then a stunning idea came to him. The guy wanted to imagine the curse in the water as dirt, and the purification magic as a magnet that attracts dirt. After that, Tenno wanted to try his idea right away. He imagined that he was using a magnet to attract everything from the bottom of the lake. Tenno used absorption magic and it worked. The darkness began to accumulate in certain areas. Suddenly, Tenno stopped being happy. The guy felt disgusted by the sight of the accumulations of darkness. Meanwhile, in the kingdom of Insperas, the knights were on guard at the entrance. A magician entered the room. The head of the magicians was asked about the stone. Since yesterday, he had been bothered by the strange pressure coming from the stone. It would be good if it wasn't so. Suddenly, the head of the magicians noticed a small crack in the stone. Tenno teleported the curse upwards. He managed to gather the darkness. The wolves watched in shock. Now the boy wanted to try to direct it in the direction where he had recently sent the curse. By combining it with part of the atmosphere, Tenno imagined that he was returning the evil back to its place. At that moment, the darkness disappeared somewhere. Everyone looked at this scene in surprise. Finally, the lake was completely cleared of the curse. Tenno looked at the purified lake with disbelief. Clean, transparent water flowed through the river. Now they just had to wait a little while for the living creatures to return to the lake. Then they happily left this place, in order to transform the house. Meanwhile, the head of the magicians was stunned. After all, the stone began to shine brightly. The bright light blinded them for a moment. When the man came to his senses, he was shocked to see that their devil's stone had a larger crack. In the throne room, the king was being told news about the kingdom. The man was bored. He only needed information about the situation in the forest. The king wanted to know what happened to the barrier in the forest after the increase in casualties yesterday. He hoped that the forest had fallen and the king of the forest had also been destroyed. After that, all remaining creatures will only need to be exterminated for the good of their country. The king's dark, bloodthirsty face frightened his servant. Suddenly, a knight burst into the throne room. He reported that something bad had happened. A crack had appeared on the magic stone. The servant asked the knight, because this room has the most powerful barrier in the entire country. Perhaps the knight imagined everything. There was no problem with the barrier. However, after the room was suddenly illuminated by a bright light, the stone cracked. The king, hearing this, was angry. The man used magic to destroy the knight who brought him the news. The knight couldn't even understand what had happened before he was eliminated. The officials immediately tensed up at this scene. Ganmilza was horrified by this unthinkable scene. Almost everyone felt that they had better not stick their necks out. If anyone tries to give advice, they will probably be eliminated. The commander of the 5th squad looked at the dead knight with a smile and pleasure. Then the king called the commander of the 4th detachment of knights. Mizarost immediately responded to the king's call. The gloomy man ordered him to immediately go into the forest and find out the reason. Akira and Kao quickly started running away when they saw the water rising in the water. Karen flew ahead so that nothing bad would happen to her. Suddenly, the water returned back to the lake. Akira fell to the ground and cried out happily that it had stopped. He thought that they were now in the process of finishing the house. The guy went into the house with the animals who had gone to sleep. He looked out the window of his future home. Kao sat next to him, and Karen, as always, sat on his shoulder. Akira decided to roast meat in the oven. The wolf watched the meat with admiration. Akira smiled and told his friend that the stove had been built, making it easier to cook. Although it was only good for frying meat for now, the first floor was the kitchen and dining room so that everyone could fit. The guy looked out the window and said with a smile that the view from the veranda was just great. Kao happily said that they also wanted to try the fried meat. The boy took some meat and said it was good, but not cooked enough. Akira blew on the meat a little to cool it down. He threw the meat to the wolf and told him to hold on. Akira tried it and beamed with happiness. He felt so good. The other wolves started running around the boy and shouting for the owner to let them try it too. It's not fair that only Koa tries it. Akira leaned towards them and awkwardly replied that it was okay, but only a little. The boy felt someone's gaze on him. He saw Chai, who was watching him closely. Akira told him to come here. The wolf came up to him and the boy said with a smile that he always kept his distance from everyone. They were friends, so he could get a piece of meat too. T happily asked what he could have too. Hyo shouted that if the owner gave it to him, then it meant he could. Shion said loudly that if he ate, then next time he could eat it willingly. T said enthusiastically that he could, then of course he would eat it. The wolves gathered in a circle and began to gobble up the fried meat that Akira had prepared. The guy thought that this was how their meals had looked lately. Akira said with an awkward smile that next time they needed to fry more meat. Akira thought that besides everything else, he now had a bathroom. The guy went there. He joyfully shouted that he felt so good now, the bath was amazing. The guy said with a smile that being able to create water and heat it effortlessly, magic is so cool. Before that, he somehow got away with cleaning magic, but still, the bathroom is much better. Akira continued to say that since he washes without soap, he can't do without magic. He lacks many things. He made a big bathtub so that everyone could bathe. He continued to reason that recently it seems they have gained weight. Will they be able to get into the bathroom now? His next wish is to get a toilet. The boy created him and hugged him. He cried and said that they finally met. Every time he wanted to be alone, Koa ran out screaming that it was dangerous for the owner alone in the forest. Akira tried to push him away. He sheepishly said that no, it was okay, he didn't need to go there. It wasn't easy for him to explain to the wolf why he should be left alone. The guy said with a smile that now this problem will disappear. At first he was afraid that nothing similar would come out of the stone, but it even looked like an ordinary toilet. Koa was sitting next to the room. He heard Akira shouting happily that it was just amazing. There was even a bidet built in, magic was so cool, there was even an auto-cleaning system. The wolf ran into the room and asked joyfully what the owner was doing there. The boy screamed in fear. The wolf left the room with a very strange expression on his face. His friend asked him what was wrong. Koa said in shock that he now thought the owner hated him because he saw him in such an indecent state. Akira came out of the room and awkwardly said that they needed to make doors. He thought that he got carried away and built a toilet on all floors. He created many things while practicing magic. The guy took the magic stone and said that, nevertheless, training with a silver crystal is more difficult to work with. He pulled it in different directions and shouted in surprise that it stretched. Akira pulled further and said that he would try to stretch it as much as possible. Koa said that he did not believe that the Misril succumbed to magic. It was amazing. The boy stopped and looked through the stone and said in admiration that it let light through. It was very similar to glass. Akira went home to test it. He inserted the glass into the windows and sat down on the windowsill. He said with a smile that he liked it very much. Akira thought that the glass was thin and strong, that he tried to make windows in the rock. The guy decided to walk around the house. He thought with a smile that he got carried away, that he made windows on each floor. Akira happily said that later he wants to make wooden floors. There is plenty of material here. Akira went into the forest. He stopped in front of a tall tree and said that this tree looked the biggest and straightest. On TV they said that you need to dry the tree before using it. How old is this tree? The boy shouted loudly that it was time to get down to business. First, he had to get rid of the branches and bark. Akira did this with his magic, which was very fast. He said that after that he should do the drying. Akira looked at the perfect tree without branches and joyfully shouted that it turned out just great, and immediately the magic of the wind. Akira happily shouted that it was ready, although there was one problem. He thought awkwardly that he had forgotten to cut off the root. The boy looked at the boards that grew out of the ground. He said, upset, that next time the tree would have to be cut down first, and for now he would teleport to the house. A whole mountain of boards appeared near his house. Akira said that now he needs to cut a shorter and put everything together. The guy said loudly that now he asks to start teleporting to the 4th floor to the bedroom. He walked into the room and proudly looked at the boards he had made himself. Akira rolled up his hands and confidently shouted that now it was time for him to start on the floors of the house. Akira imagined a perfect floor in his mind, where every board lay perfectly and gleamed. He thought that flooring was easy, just lay the boards and that's it. The guy said irritably that at least he thought so. Akira carefully stepped on the floor and thought that gaps immediately appeared, and the thickness of the boards was different. Akira continued to reason that the boards themselves were huge and heavy. He couldn't lay them down evenly using teleportation. He was very upset that he couldn't do it. The guy let out an irritated breath and said that everything was not going as he had imagined, and also, if you think about it, if you don't follow the rules, the floor will get ruined. Akira put down a couple of boards and sat down on them. He looked at the pile of boards and said tiredly that he still had so much to do. Koa climbed onto the windowsill and watched his master with interest. The boy came down saying that he needed to take a break. He picked up the stone and went back to Koa. He sat on the windowsill and the wolf went down to the floor to watch further. Akira looked at the stone and said that it would be good to get good knives soon. He would try to make them from these hard silver stones. The guy stretched it and said that it was even thinner. Akira looked at the finished version and happily said that everything was just great. He had given it the right shape. The guy walked up to the rock and shouted that he needed to try it. He stuck the knife in and shouted happily that it was so cool. The rock itself wasn't strong, he needed to be careful with the blades. Akira smiled at the stone he had melted and said that it was interesting, but the shape of such stones could easily be changed with magic. Koa and Karen listened to the boy with interest. He asked with a smile what could make him a saucepan. Akira began to stretch the material. The guy said that what he would like is other food besides meat. Akira continued to say that later he thinks that he will need kitchen utensils and door hinges, a vent for the windows, and also an exit on the 4th floor. The boy looked at the doll he had made. Akira shouted happily that he had made something cute. He hadn't made clay for a long time. It was so much fun. Koa yawned loudly from boredom. Akira lined up 3 dolls. He picked up a stone and looked at it carefully. The guy thoughtfully said that this stone itself sparkled. It would make the eyes more luminous. Akira made another doll and placed it next to the others. He picked up the next stone and thought with a smile that he would make some more. He was having so much fun doing this. Night fell and everyone went to bed. The dolls were left standing on the windowsill. Akira woke up in the morning and moaned sleepily. He noticed Koa getting up from his place. The boy tiredly told him that it was good morning, but he asked to let him sleep a little more. Akira noticed that the floor was laid perfectly. He screamed in surprise. He couldn't figure out who did it, because the floor was laid so perfectly, it was shining. Akira heard someone say that the whole floor needed to be finished now. The boy turned his head and noticed the dolls that were dragging the board. They worked very harmoniously. They even had a commander who controlled them. The dolls measured the length of the board, and if something was wrong, one of the dolls would cut out the unnecessary part with a knife that Akira had created before. They were able to make a perfect layout. The wolves looked at the new residents, and then with interest at Akira. The guy turned away from Koa's face and awkwardly said that he didn't know how it happened, but they had 9 of them. Akira asked hesitantly, "What are those dolls he made yesterday?" "Yes, why are they moving?" "The dolls went to get a new board to finish the work in this house." The boy awkwardly said that he remembered when he made them. He thought about the story about the gnomes who helped make shoes. Before going to bed, he thought it would be nice to finish the floors. He thought in shock that it was all because of his thoughts. Akira opened the door to another room saying that there was one more missing. The guy saw another doll sitting alone on the windowsill. Akira picked it up and sadly said that it was because he had no idea when he made it. The boy went back to the other dolls who were carrying boards. The boy shouted loudly for them to stop working. He was announcing a general assembly. The dolls quickly ran towards him. They stood in one line and began to wait for Akira's order. The boy awkwardly said that they were listening to an order. The dolls looked at him attentively. Akira looked tensely at the doll in his hand and sat it down next to the others. He confidently told the doll that she was a robot assistant and now she needed to move. The doll stood up and walked over to her friends. She happily started waving her arms. The boy smiled and thought that he was alive. That's how it moves. Akira told the doll that he relied on it. The dolls ran in different directions to continue their work. Akira shouted happily, "That's fine. They work fast, beautifully and qualitatively. It's easier for him. After all, they are cute." The wolves sat fearfully behind the guy. The wolves screamed hysterically that these were golems. They were the same as they had seen in the forest before, the ones that humans used for military purposes. Koa growled loudly for them to calm down. A doll came up to the wolf and tried to touch it. The wolf moved away from it in fear. Akira said with a smile that it was so cute. He thought that for some reason the wolves were afraid of clay men. He hoped that they would soon live in peace. Akira thought happily that the dolls had already managed to lay 23 boards. Now that he had been kindly relieved of this work, he could continue exploring the forest. He and his friends went outside. The wolves cried out joyfully that they were going hunting. They would get a lot of meat. Akira waved goodbye to them with a smile. Koa stayed with him. Akira told him and Karen that they would now go and find vegetables and spices. They went deep into the forest. The boy asked what he was wondering if they went further away from the mountains. There was still a curse there. Akira thought that then he would clean it along the way. The boy looked at the sky and thought that the cause of the curse remains where the light penetrates and what to do if it comes back again and again. Akira exhaled angrily and thought, well, that's his problem. The guy smiled and told his friends that the forest had become much more beautiful compared to when he first came here. The boy asked Koa with interest what he thought about it. Akira raised his head and sighed in surprise. He joyfully shouted that these were fruits. He had just seen them now. Akira shouted that it was cool and they were edible. The guy touched the tree and sadly said that he wouldn't be able to climb the tree. He was so upset they searched for so long and now here you are. Suddenly, a spider jumped out. Akira looked at it in surprise and joyfully shouted that a spider can crawl. Then, other spiders began to appear one after another. Akira asked in shock what was going on. There were 8 of them now. The guy thought awkwardly that if he looked closely, they didn't have wings. Could they really be babies? The guy continued to reason that not even a week had passed since they first met, so how quickly they grow up, or is it just his imagination? Akira thought that he was imagining things, or Koa had also grown bigger, and he was almost 2 meters tall. Suddenly, a fruit fell to the ground. The guy happily shouted that they were able to climb it. He picked it up and looked at it carefully. Akira said that they were still edible, bright red, must be sweet. Apparently, animals eat them. The boy cut the fruit and looked at the pulp with admiration. It looked so delicious. Akira took a bite and cried. He happily shouted that it was so delicious. The boy wiped his tears and said that he hadn't eaten fruit in so long. He was so happy. Crunchy, tasted like a peach, ripe and sweet. He gave some to the spiders and the birds and didn't leave out Koa either. They picked a whole mountain of fruit. Akira looked happily at the fragrant fruit. Koa said hesitantly that it seemed they had overdone it a bit. The guy asked what they would do with it now. He tried to stuff it into the fruit and said that the bag barely fits one. Akira thought tiredly that this bag would become like the mouth of a Pac-Man. Suddenly, his bag was transformed by his words. He stuffed all the fruits into the bag, and the bag also remained small. Akira thought happily that all 30 pieces fit. Magic is an unpredictable thing. He laughed awkwardly. They went further and saw cabbage. They gathered some. At that time, the wolves were driving the boars to the boy. They tried very hard to be useful to Akiro. The boy shouted loudly that they were back. The wolf shouted that they were back too. Akiro shouted joyfully that they had a good hunt today as he noticed. He asked with interest that they were not hurt. The wolf cried out joyfully for the owner to see how much meat he and Soa had brought. Akiro stroked the wolf and cried out that he could see everything. Now it was all clean. Akiro turned the bag over and shook out all the fruits and vegetables. The guy awkwardly said that he himself hadn't expected so much. Volky watched the new products with interest. The guy happily thought that even without salt, with all this you can greatly diversify the diet. Akiro took off his jacket and joyfully shouted that it was time to get down to business. He said that first you need to remove the blood, then cut it with a knife, and then open it with air magic. Akiro ripped open the boar and carefully began to cut it into pieces. He put the pieces of meat on the ground and loudly told the wolves that they could help themselves. Akiro pointed to the horribly smelling pieces of boar and said that the internal organs were there. If they wanted, they could help themselves. The guy thought that he had taken all the meat apart, leaving some to eat now and some for storage. The wolf happily told his friend that the meat the owner had cut up was simply awesome and so convenient to eat. T happily replied that he had eaten his fill of liver. Akiro looked at the carcasses of meat and said wearily that it was getting crowded in front of the house. When there would be salt, he would have to make ham, and he would also have to learn how to tan leather. Akiro took the meat to the refrigerator. He thought with a smile that he had set up a cold storage room on the lowest floor. Fruits and vegetables probably shouldn't be stored here, he would think of something later. Karen was drooling over the fried meat. Akiro came up to her and said with a smile that he should thank her for watching. Karen seemed to like the fried meat better. Karen chirped. Akiro said that it was already well fried. By the way, even in its raw form, this vegetable is sweet. It looks like something between cabbage and lettuce, and the inside is soft. The guy picked up the fruit and a knife. He started cutting it, saying that the fruit was bright green with a refreshing sour aroma. If you sprinkle its juice on fried meat. Akiro wrapped the meat in a cabbage leaf and happily began to eat. He shouted with a smile that this was such bliss. The vegetables were so sweet and juicy, and the slight sourness was just something. The guy said he wanted to say it was delicious. Even though it was just regular meat, it still really needed some sauce. By the way, everyone except Karen had gotten a couple of sizes bigger. He was very curious about what happened to the spiders. Akiro went to the first floor where they were working on dolls. He shouted happily that they were doing such a great job. They had already reached the kitchen. The guy thought that the first floor was finished in 3 days. Akiro took the board in his hands and told the dolls that now they should make a bed. They can make a box from 2001-160 boards. The dolls gathered together and began to discuss something. The guy went into the forest. He happily said that, by the way, the issue with food and housing was solved. There was still something left. Akiro said that he asked the spider to appear. Suddenly, a spider appeared, but it looked much bigger than last time. Akiro thought in surprise that it was big now. He thought uncomfortably that it was as he expected, a little creepy if you think about it. The spider cried out joyfully for its owner to look at it. Thanks to his generosity and magical power, its body began to recover. It and the children are incredibly grateful to him. The spider asked with interest that it probably took a lot of magical power to create the barrier and the golem, and all of this, including them, needs to be kept under control, which causes him inconvenience. Akiro leaned towards the spider and thought with a smile that he wanted to tell him something. It seemed that they did have intelligence, but they behaved quite friendly. The boy remembered something and told the spider that he wanted to ask this. Akiro thought that he always wore the same clothes and they were worn out. He had to wash them every day. Akiro clenched his fist and thought confidently that spiders weave webs. How come he hadn't thought of that before? He really wants to get new clothes instead of the container. The boy asked the spider with interest what he knew from which a long thread could be woven. The spider looked at the boy carefully but did not answer him. Akiro wondered if he really understood him. Akiro and his friends ran after the spider. The boy looked at the wolves and thought with a smile that this time Koa was not at home, so they went with them. Akiro smiled and told Kuro and Chai that he was counting on them. Kuro shouted happily that they were trusted to accompany the master. Chai say, well, since you are the master, well, it is necessary. T thought that this is what Koa usually does. This is a chance to prove himself. The wolf shouted loudly that he needs to live up to expectations. Akiro asked the spider what was here. They saw the caterpillars and screamed in fear. Akiro was shocked to think that these were giant caterpillars. Did he really do something wrong to the spider and that's why he brought them here? The spider picked up the caterpillars and happily asked what would soothe the owner. The wolf asked fearfully, "Isn't it a deadly poisonous insect? It's dangerous." The spider replied that if he was not angered, everything would be fine. The caterpillar shot threads at Akiro. The boy covered his face with his hands and screamed loudly. The wolves and the spider also screamed loudly. The spider asked the caterpillar in fear what was going on. Akiro looked at his hand, which was wrapped in threads, and said that he was so scared that for a second he thought he was being attacked. Akiro added that he imagined it a little differently, but these threads seem strong, they can be used. He is very grateful to the spider. The spider exhaled and happily said that he was ready to accept punishment from the owner's hand. The wolves at this time looked at the owner in shock. They even cried from fear. Kuro disappointedly told T that they were completely out of work. Akiro asked the spider with a smile that he could take a couple of kids home if he didn't mind. The caterpillars were put on the wolves, who felt humiliated by this. They went home. The spider said that he had warned them not to spit poison, so they need not worry. T kept saying that they were just insects. Just insects. Akiro awkwardly said that he was asking Kuro and T to forgive him. They finally returned home. Koa asked Chai with a smile why he was talking about insects like a wind-up toy. The wolf screamed in fear that no, nothing at all happened, everything was fine. Akiro hugged the wolf and shouted happily that he was glad Koa was back. He asks him to do something nice. Chai was shocked to think that this happened to him. The boy entered the house and shouted that they were back. Akiro thought he had noticed it when he made the bathroom and the cold chamber, but the stone in this cave can accumulate magic, and it has a long-lasting effect. He proudly said that as a result, the floor cleans itself and dirt does not accumulate. Akiro shouted to the wolf that the second floor was free, that is where they will make the incubator. He poured out the leaves and said that all that was left was to ventilate. Akiro put 2 caterpillars in a pile of leaves and said that there would be enough food for a while. Akiro looked at the 2 golems and said that now they needed someone to take care of them. He couldn't be with them all the time. The dolls happily raised their hands up, which meant they would do it. The boy happily said that these dolls would look after them. The caterpillars began to spin around in the leaves in fear. Akiro said in surprise that they were scared, but they were so cute. He pulled the t-shirt and said that now they will have threads. Akira took off the t-shirt and began to carefully examine it. He thought about how to make fabric. They consult. The dolls took the t-shirt in their hands and called another doll. The doll began to wave her arms quickly. They began to bring the t-shirt into good shape so that it could be worn. Akiro said in surprise that it was even better than he expected. He asked the doll with interest, "By the way, how are things going with the bed they were talking about?" The doll grabbed his hand and led him into another room. Akiro saw a large bed and shouted in admiration that they had done everything in just half a day. They were so good. Akiro proudly shouted that they were getting closer and closer to civilized life. The dolls also looked at him proudly, because they did all this. The guy happily said that he wished the night would come soon. Night came and Akiro said goodnight to everyone. He lay down on the bed and covered himself with his jacket. He was not very comfortable sleeping and he called Koa to lie down next to him. Akiro lay down on the wolf and thought that he was so soft, like a mattress, even better. Akiro entered the room and looked at the work going on. The room looked almost finished. The boy thought that it seemed like the stone dolls were getting better and better every day. Akiro asked in surprise that just yesterday there were only bare walls here. He went up to the table and pulled out the chair. The guy said that they made such stylish furniture. He had recently seen it on the internet. The doll placed a plate of meat on his table and placed chopsticks next to it. Akiro happily shouted that these were chopsticks. Then, the doll brought a glass of water. The guy ate some food and thought with a smile that this was such bliss, how simple and familiar. It seemed to be the same meat, the same water, but it felt twice as tasty. Akiro turned his head and began to watch the dolls work. Suddenly, he asked in surprise that there were 8 of them, and where were the other 2, in the room with the caterpillars, or something. Akiro tried on his new clothes. He shouted happily that he now had a jacket. The guy touched the clothes on himself and shouted that he now had a green jacket and black pants. Akiro happily shouted that they felt smooth as silk. The guy sat down in front of the leaves and fruits. He asked with interest if the color of the threads really depended on what the caterpillars ate. The guy turned his head and said with a smile that, finally. Akiro looked at the new clothes and joyfully shouted that several sets of underwear. Akiro thought that while they were studying him, of course, it was incredibly embarrassing. The guy approached the doll, which was sitting at the machine, and other dolls were walking around it. The guy said in surprise that they made a loom. He seemed to have seen one like that on TV. They did it themselves. It was so cool, he felt a little uneasy. They went outside. Akira said happily that he felt so light, so he was sure that their search would be successful today. The wolves ran next to the guy. The boy told the wolf with a smile that he wanted to find spices so much. There are stones from which you can get salt. They will start with whether there is a sea in this world. Akira stepped on a patch of ground and said that it was soft. He stopped in front of the cave and began to peer into the darkness. The guy said that they found another cave. Akira said he didn't remember them being there. Koa said it was so strange, such a big hole, so close to home, very strange. They went inside and started looking around. Akira looked down and said that there was a gentle slope inside. There were signs of a curse too though. Akira shouted for the light to turn on. With his magic, the cave became bright. The boy told Koa that they should go to the place, but they should be careful. Akira and all his friends started walking deeper into the cave. The guy stopped in front of another entrance. He said tensely that the cave started to lighten. Suddenly, they heard strange sounds from there. Koa looked ahead angrily. The guy thought tensely about what that sound was. They went inside and saw that there were bats sitting on the ceiling and huge ants on the floor. Akira screamed in fear. What the hell was going on here? The ant crawled up to the guy. He shed a tear from fear and screamed hysterically that there were huge ants here. Koa growled loudly. Akira shouted loudly that no, and Koa was huge too. They started fighting each other. The guy thought that a confrontation between a giant ant and a giant werewolf had begun. Akira thought fearfully that it was not the time to stand and watch. The boy screamed that he was calling for purification. The ant continued to advance on Akira and all his friends. The guy screamed in shock that it didn't work. The barrier was strengthened immediately. The ant jumped high and began to fall on the guy, who covered his face with his hands. Akira was scared that something bad was going to happen. He closed his eyes as the ant was already approaching him. Koa stood in front of his master to protect him from the giant ant. Koa bit the ant's leg and threw it away. Akira jumped up from the ground and looked at the other ants. He noticed that they were covered in some kind of black liquid. The ants stood in front of the wolves, who were ready to defend themselves. Akira thought hard about the black stains. He really didn't like it. It seemed like they had a problem. The wolves were protecting Akira from the ants. The barrier was activated, but they still couldn't relax that easily. The ants started banging their heads against the barrier to break through. The boy exhaled and thought that the barrier seemed to be working. Koa growled angrily at the ants, his fur standing on end from his anger. Akira wondered why the purification hadn't worked and what to do now. He looked at the giant ants and thought that the ants had some kind of black stains on their bodies. It looked like the filth that had stolen Koa and his friend's fur when they first met. Akira continued to reason that perhaps the curse had completely taken over their body, then there must be a way to expel it. He had to find it to save himself. Koa growled loudly when he noticed one of the ants had broken through the barrier. Akira screamed loudly, horror. The ant began to fall right on the boy, who didn't know what to do. Akira turned away and screamed no. Suddenly, the barrier worked and threw the ants away from the boy. Koa growled furiously when he noticed that his master was in danger. Akira screamed in fear that no, the picture didn't add up, so something had to be done. Does this mean that there is not one creature in one body, but two? Does this mean that they are possessed? The boy continued to reason that they were as if bound by invisible chains. Akira shouted loudly that he understood everything. It was necessary to destroy the curse that had taken over the mind. The guy stretched his hand forward and shouted loudly to remove the curse. The ants began to glow and the curse began to come out of them. The black stains disappeared on the ants. The ant thought that the black magic that filled the forest sent the waters of the river and the fruits of the trees. The kings of the forest resist, but their resistance is becoming weaker and weaker, and the people did not hear their pleas. He continued to reason that somewhere a new monster appears, and the forest is plunged into darkness again. There is only darkness around. Dark magic envelops the soul and body. They too have turned into monsters and have become enemies of the forest. The ant said no. After all, the king of the forest is powerless here. Oh, the dragon who lives in the forest waters, he asks to help them. He closed his eyes and there was nothing more. The ant opened his eyes and saw Akira, who asked if he was okay. The guy stroked his head and cried out in admiration that he was so smooth. The ant was shocked and wondered what was going on. Koa told the ant that he didn't recognize him right away, but it was still him, and for Fulmi. The ant asked him if he was King Fenrir. Anfer crawled somewhere, and everyone followed him. Akira raised his head and noticed that ants were crawling on the ceiling. Suddenly, he stumbled and almost fell. An ant saved him. The guy said with a smile that he was grateful to him. Akira looked at the ant and thought that Koa said that everything was fine. It had been half an hour already and this ant looked absolutely normal, but was it as harmless as a spider? The ant stopped and looked somewhere to the side. Akira asked in surprise that they had come. The guy shouted loudly for the light to appear. The room lit up and now everything could be seen. Koa asked if this was the home of the water dragon. Anfer replied that it was true, King Fenrir. There should have been a beautiful sacred lake here, full of magical power, but it is no longer there, is it? Akira touched the barrier and screamed angrily that this terrible curse was happening again. He was ordering the curse to be removed by purification. The boy thought that perhaps there were other creatures suffering from the curse's possession like this ant. The boy exhaled and thought that he needed to imagine how the spell spread throughout the forest. Akira shouted loudly that he was ordering the curse to be lifted. He thought with confidence that the curse would not return. The cave glowed white. Koa screamed in surprise and called loudly for Akira to look. The boy opened his eyes and looked at the lake, which was shining and sparkling. Akira and the others looked in admiration at this beautiful lake, which was cleansed of the curse. Anfer wondered what it was. Where did such a cleansing and healing power come from? They left the cave. The guy relaxed a little. He felt a little tired. Akira looked at the sky and said that yes, they had a problem with the spices. The guy patted Koa and said with a smile that they should keep looking. The ant crawled after them. Akira thought awkwardly that he was following us. Well, okay, let him go. The guy turned his head and noticed the fruit. He tore off the fruit and shouted happily that he was able to get it. Akira brought it to his mouth, when suddenly Koa asked what was edible. The guy said that it didn't smell like anything. He bit off a piece and screamed in surprise that it was salty. The boy turned to Koa and shouted joyfully that he had tasted the salt he had dreamed of. They would collect as much as they could carry and return home. Mizuros screamed in shock at what had happened. They were in the forest. The man walked away for a while, and when he returned, he saw that many knights were wounded and defeated. It all started about half a month ago. Mizuros was in Ganmilse's office. The man said to his friend with displeasure that he was now profusely apologizing. Mizuros asked disappointedly that he had just returned from the forest, and now he had to investigate something. Does the king want to drive the knights of the 4th Squad to death? Ganmilse told Mizuros to watch his tongue. No one asked his opinion. The man angrily shouted that he had already put in a lot of effort when the magic stone cracked. He added that, and what's there that crack, so a scratch, magic stones that can be obtained after defeating monsters, the size of the tip of the little finger. Mizuros said that compared to them, the stone in the castle was simply gigantic. Nothing would happen to it from this crack. Ganmilse listened to him attentively. He took some document in his hands and said that yes, the document said that when the magic stone was first found, it was all cracked. Mizuros shouted in surprise that it was true, then, especially, there was no need to panic. The man continued to say that, however, if the situation is really not as simple as it seems at first glance, then the problem should be approached as carefully as possible. Mizuros thought that the knights of the 4th Division always worked hard in the forest. They mainly defeated and captured monsters. Exploring the forest was also one of the tasks. He continued to reason that they had been there many times before, but nothing supernatural had happened. There was only a dark and gloomy forest, the same as always. Mizuros told his friend that he thought that this time too it was nothing serious. Ganmilse asked what he thought, and what if something was happening in the heart of the forest. Mizuros got up from the sofa and asked in surprise what he meant by all these forest kings. Ganmilse replied that he didn't know. The man thought that he definitely didn't know, but there was something to it. Mizuros asked him with a laugh if he was really afraid. True, it would be difficult to reach the depths of the forest because of the monsters possessed by the magic of the evil eye. This is a big problem. The man continued to say that even if something went wrong, their strongest nation in the world could not lose. Ganmilse replied that they would hope. Mizuros came out of his friend's cabin. A guy ran up to him and said that he was asked to select 20 talented slaves. Mizuros turned to him and looked at him carefully. He replied that he needed 1 minute. He needed to make a request for the preparation of knights. This time, he needed only the most elite warriors. The journey to the forest would take, at best, 10 days. The boy shouted that he was happening. He quickly ran away somewhere. Mizuros exhaled and asked why Ganmilse was being so cautious. The knight asked what he was talking about, the commander of the 1st Squad of Knights. Mizuros said sheepishly that no, he didn't mean anything like that. They'd been friends for years, but he was sure he was too smart to worry about that. The guy asked that, by the way, he was the only knight who did not use slaves. Mizuros answered the knight that, it seemed, slaves were the same people for him. Mizuros thought that Esperanza's slaves were marked from birth with the strongest slave brand. They felt no emotion, did not rebel, and did not utter a word without orders. The man said that, in essence, they become practically sexless beings. If you don't think about it, life would be much easier. No matter how you look at it, slaves are just slaves. The guy answered with a smile that he agreed. He was of the same opinion. Mizuros thoughtfully said that he was still not as cruel as the commander of the 5th Squad. He continued to say that if you think about it, it's no wonder that many are sacrificed to the magic stone. The guy looked at the commander carefully. Mizuros awkwardly shouted at him to forget about it. The boy laughed and said that he liked this side of Mizuros' fireplace. The man asked him angrily that he was making fun of him. Gamilze was filling out paperwork in his office. He thought that no matter what Mizuros said, he still thought that they had to go deeper into the forest, otherwise they wouldn't find out anything. He continued to reason that although he believed that the Knights of the 4th Detachment were already more experienced explorers of the village, they did not even bypass a tenth of it, which was not very good. Ganmilze thought that this forest occupied half of their world, and no one had ever reached its depths. He heard that hundreds of years after the magic was cast, the forest dwellers began to counterattack. The man walked over to the bookcase and picked up one of the books. He thought, however, he didn't think it could affect the magic stone outside the barrier that was set up over the forest. Ganmilze sat down at his desk and thought that, moreover, since the stone was discovered, countless sacrifices had already been made to it, which had strengthened it considerably. The man put the pen back in the inkwell and wondered if it meant what he thought it meant. Ganmilze asked in shock that someone stronger than the Forest Kings had appeared. Half a month later. The knights were fighting a monster in the forest. They screamed loudly and pierced the monster with their swords. It fell to the ground and would never rise again. The knight laughed loudly. His friend shouted joyfully that they had done it. Mizuros came up to them and asked discontentedly that maybe they would stop this already. The knight replied that it was ridiculous. Mizuros replied without emotion that here was the thing. Even when they had been in the forest for about half a day, they still hadn't encountered many monsters. The man continued to say that there were only 4 of them, although under normal circumstances there should have been 10. Moreover, they were enhanced magical monsters from his country, and they were only supposed to attack forest creatures. Mizuros said discontentedly that it was a problem if only the mages had gone with them, but they could not blame them. He turned his head towards the forest and thought that something was wrong. The guy looked at the trees and asked if this forest was strange. They answered that no, everything was as usual. It was a very ordinary forest. There was no need to worry. Mizuros hugged himself and thought uncomfortably that something was wrong with him, this strange feeling, fear, gradually penetrating his soul. He heard strange sounds and shouted loudly for everyone to stop. Mizuros thought they could take a rest now. The knight shouted for the scouts to get to work. He loudly added that they should go ahead and see if there were any dangerous creatures nearby. Mizuros said that if there was no danger, then their destination was no Miyagi. The commander added that they should make sure that 5 of the slaves stood guard in 3 shifts. The knights asked tensely that there was something strange here. Mizuros asked sternly if there were any suggestions. The knight awkwardly replied that no, nothing like that. The commander sighed wearily from all the problems that had piled up on him. The assistant commander came up and looked at the frightened knights. He loudly told him to calm down. If the men did not rest, they would not be able to continue their journey. He went on to say that slaves had no fear, of course, not because they were born fearless. They had good hearing and smell, so they were safe for now, he thought. The guy said that he had received information that there was no threat nearby. Mizuros said with a smile that if that was the case, they could continue their mission. Suddenly, they heard a scream. Mizuros turned excitedly towards the forest. He saw the barrier glow, which meant someone was trying to get through it. The knight screamed in fear that Gitites. Mizuros thought in shock that he had passed through a wall of light. No one had attacked, and everyone was safe, but everything was strange. The monster roared loudly, the ground beneath the knight's feet began to glow, and they screamed in fear. Mizuros shouted loudly for them to calm down, to prepare for a counterattack. Some time passed, and the man examined all the damage they had received. Mizuros fell to the ground and said in shock what happened. So it was an attack by the Lord of the Forest. Those lying on the ground are simply unconscious, no one was injured. A knight ran up to him and shouted excitedly that they couldn't find a single slave. Mizuros asked in surprise what he meant. He thought they had all disappeared. The knight replied that no, it seemed they had escaped themselves. The man, incredulous, thought that the slavery emblem had been broken. Mizuros said that they should inform the king about this. Akira was walking in the forest. He told the ant that if they were going to be together, they should come up with a name. It was a bit difficult for him to name the giant ant. The guy said thoughtfully that it could be a red or crimson body, although they would call him Shuri, a very good name. The ant said that, if it came to that. The ant's voice was interrupted by the wolves, who growled happily. The black wolf cried out happily that Koa and Akira had returned late today. They could no longer sit with the golem. Koa said that he asked their forgiveness for this. The wolf asked with interest what had happened. The black wolf answered that he had caught his prey and decided to leave it in the room where they usually kept everything. He added plaintively that he had been struck with a huge sword, and that it was a golem that had done it. There was nothing more terrible. The wolf noticed a huge ant and screamed in shock that it was a guardian of hell. The spider asked with interest why the guardian of hell was with his master. The ant angrily screamed for him to tell him what he was doing here. The insects stood opposite each other. Akira asked in surprise that the two of them were not getting along. He begs them not to fight. The giant insects looked at him. They noticed that the guy really looked scared. The ant told the spider that since they couldn't do anything about it, he suggested they make a truce. The spider replied that he didn't like him, but since the master wanted it, so be it. They also didn't want to lose their home. Koa thought that the master had united the two races that hated each other so much. The master's power was indeed enormous. In that case, they were in the same boat. Akira returned home and entered the room where the dolls were working. He shouted in surprise that they had finished the ceiling. The golem began to jump and show something to the boy. The guy asked that they needed boards. Those boards were already finished, and the beams were also finished. He understood everything. He would soon bring them new materials for the room. Akira said with a smile that there would be more important work tomorrow. The boy took out new fruits. He confidently shouted that much had already been done, but his next goal was to make salt. He said that he was very afraid that it might not work, so he would only use 5 of them and put the rest in the vault. In the vault, he used time-stopping magic, and so far it seems to be working well. Akira said that he would first cover the silver bowl with a cloth and then squeeze the juice into the bowl. The boy began to give fruits with all his might, and the juice began to appear quickly. The guy said with a smile that he had made quite a lot. All that was left was to cook the juice slowly so that the contents did not burn. The wolves watched the man with interest. Akira said excitedly that it was still kind of dirty, so he had to filter the juice again. The guy did this for 2 hours. The wolves had already fallen asleep from waiting. The boy looked into the cup and shouted joyfully that the salt was ready. Akira ran away shouting that he would now make a good container for the salt. In the end, he filled all the containers with salt. Akira happily said that the very hard gold that was difficult to use made a beautiful container. He was so happy about it that he finally had salt. The guy started waving the container of salt and joyfully shouting that now he could easily use not only silver, but also magical gold. Akira said with a smile that he had been working hard for half a day, all in order to taste delicious meat. The guy carefully cut the steaks and put them on the table. He said that the defrosted steak should be sprinkled with salt and covered with aromatic leaves for a while. The wolves leaned over to try. Akira told them that it was salt, so they couldn't eat it. The guy put the meat on the stove and said that the meat had to be fried very carefully to be tasty. He said he would really like a frying pan and some oil. He had seen on TV that lard could be made from pork fat, and when the meat was cooked, you wrapped it in a sheet and waited a bit. Akira put the food on a plate and said with a smile that the meat should look fried at the end. The boy tried a piece and moaned happily. He cried from the taste of the meat. The wolf reached for the dish. Akira picked it up and asked with a laugh what wasn't prepared for them. This meat is salted, so they can't have it. The wolf really wanted to try it. Akira gave in and said that it was good, but only a little. The guy treated his friends to some tasty meat with salt. He exhaled and said that he also had to keep an eye on them so that they didn't eat too many unhealthy things. After all, they knew that Karen would be eating it with them. The boy looked at the board with the piece of meat on it, but there was no bird. Akira raised his head and called Karen. The bird flew up into the sky and went somewhere without warning anyone. Akira stirred the water in the barrel. He said with tears in his eyes that Karen had not returned since yesterday. She was wild, so everything should be fine. The boy began to stir the water furiously. He screamed hysterically that she was still very small. Animals or something else terrible could attack her. He was so worried about her. Koa said with a smile that if the owner was so worried about Karen, then it was in vain. No matter what, she was always by his side. Besides, she probably had a lot of magical powers. The wolf excitedly asked the boy what about him. His magic powers had already been restored. Akira hugged the wolf and cried. He excitedly shouted that Koa was worried about him. The boy scratched the wolf and happily shouted that he asked him and the other wolves not to leave him. Koa happily told the owner to scratch him some more. He really liked it. Akira hugged the wolf and thought that he had calmed down a bit and could get to work. The boy decided to work on the skins. He thought that he had tried to process skins before, but it was not an easy task. The guy continued to reason that he thought that he needed to get rid of the meat and fat first, and tried to do it with magic, but everything flew into pieces. Akira touched the meat and said that if he used a knife, he would make a lot of holes. After cutting off the excess, he decided to wash the skin. The water immediately turned dark with dirt, and the skin itself shrank and began to stink. He thought that after all, the most difficult task remained. Akira hung the skin on the wood and said that now it was drying. The guy thought that the skin always hardens at the edges, after which it is impossible to soften it. Akira continued to think that naturally he had no idea what he was doing wrong. He didn't know how to process the skins. The guy said that he would have to rinse this one last time. The boy threw the skin, and the wolf caught it. Akira said that if only he had a good skin, he could make a blanket or a rug. If he could get the skin, he could make shoes and other small things. The boy imagined all these things and thought that it was just a fairy tale. The wolf said that he wondered what the owner had been up to lately. It didn't look like anything edible. Koa brought the animal in his teeth. Akira shouted joyfully that they could wait a little while before returning. The boy ran away shouting that everyone had started eating more, so it was hard to divide into portions. The spider stopped the boy and showed him his prey. He proudly said that he had also had a good hunt today. Akira looked at his friend who had changed in fear. He thought uncomfortably that ever since Suri had come, Oyadama had been growing and growing, as if competing with him. Just how big did the animals grow in this world? Akira looked at Koa and said that he was also the size of a car. The guy happily said that they also had salt, so he would try to make ham. The next day came. Akira ran to the clearing in fear, shouting that he had left the skin in the water since yesterday. The boy pulled the wet skin out of the water. He said that nothing would happen if he dried it. Akira said with disgust that the water had turned brown. The guy hung it up to dry. He touched it and said in surprise that it had become softer than the previous times. The boy wondered with interest what the reason was. Akira said that it was because he had left that stick in the water. He took it and said that tree sap was flowing out of it. Kira took a bucket of water and said with a smile that after collecting that wood, he tried to make a decoction. He could start doing that already, but he was still not sure. Akira shouted loudly that he was collecting stone golems, kuni. The guy picked up the doll and happily shouted that this time they turned out so cute. The ant screamed in fear that the owner was making more and more of these golems. Akira thought that, by the way, he called the golems that were before the first and the third. The guy smiled and told the first one to bring here 3 skins that he froze. The golems brought them to him and tried to show him something. Akira asked in surprise what they wanted to try themselves. Akira watched with interest as the golems did their work. He wondered uncomfortably if it was too fast. The boy approached them and looked closely at their work. He said with interest that they divided the solution into 3 parts and then broke it. Golem showed how they dried the skin. Akira shouted that it was clear. If you stretch it like this, the skin won't shrink. The guy thought nervously that, although he had made them, they were more skilled than him. How could that be? The dolls began to show something to the guy. Akira shouted in surprise that they needed more wood, and there was not enough space in front of the house. The boy came to the forest and looked at the stumps. He asked himself that he was the first to ask him for wood, so should he kill 2 birds with 1 stone? Akira felled another tree. He touched it and said that all the trees here were several hundred years old. He even felt sorry to cut them down. Koa pointed to the tree and joyfully shouted that the owner needed this tree too. The boy asked, in surprise, what else he needed to cut down. Wasn't that enough? Akira said that he should probably process the edges and then move them to the 3rd and minus the 1st floor. He noticed the dolls grabbing the boards. Akira asked with interest what else they were making. The dolls didn't answer but simply ran away. The guy wiped his sweat and exhaled tiredly. He looked at the cut-down forest and said that it seemed he had overdone it. Akira went into the house and started taking off his shoes, saying that he would leave his shoes here today. The boy entered the room and saw the chair that the doll happily presented. Akira turned his head and shouted in surprise that it was the hanging chair he had dreamed of since high school. The guy happily added that, and they recreated it in such detail, it was terrifying. He went into another room and saw a bathroom. Akira touched it and shouted in admiration that the bathroom was also made of wood. He went on to explore the house. The guy happily shouted that the stairs were covered with boards and had railings. There were even small anti-slip things, but the toilet also had no doors. Akira thought with a smile that Karen would be surprised when she returned. At that moment, the bird returned to the cave. She happily watched the clear water. She was expecting something. The boy returned to the forest saying that today he had to do something about this clearing of stumps. He stopped and began to look at the ground in surprise where there had been stumps yesterday. Akira screamed in shock what had happened. He said that the stumps just disappeared. Akira noticed the ants carrying the stump. The boy said that it was the ants doing it. He followed them to their cave. He said with a smile that an ant had taken them. His ant friend noticed him and joyfully shouted that he was glad to see his master in their house. He could pass through. It was much more comfortable here than in Oyadam's nest. The ant looked at him impatiently. Akira thought he had a feeling that he was being lured. The boy awkwardly said that he was asking for forgiveness but he would refrain. The boy noticed how the ants were crawling underground. He said that the ants were hiding underground. Akira shouted in surprise that they had leveled the holes from the stumps perfectly. The earth was well loosened. The guy happily said that for sure, why not make beds for them? If it works out, he won't have to go looking for vegetables every time. That way he can grow as much as he needs. Akira added with a smile that he would start with potatoes from this world. They seemed unpretentious. The guy thought that if it was about soil, he knew who to turn to. Akira ran up to Suri and asked him what he knew about vegetables that grow underground. The guy drew a picture on the ground to make it easier for the ant to understand. Suri looked at him in surprise. Akira said that he wanted something that was underground and could be eaten. The ant stirred excitedly and quickly began to crawl away. Akira waved his hand at him with a smile. The boy took some soil in his hands and asked the doll that since they were making beds, he should make some fertilizer. His father often told him about fertilizer. Akira and the dolls set to work. The boy said that first they would dig a hole in the shade of the trees, and then they would assemble a wooden fence. Then they would fill it with food scraps mixed with dead grass and leaves. The boy and the dolls jumped on the ground to suppress various waste. Akira lowered his hand to the ground and said, to start the process of decay, you need to thoroughly wet it. He said happily that it was just the perfect humidity. Now all that was left was to wait. Akira said that, by the way, a long time ago he had once, out of curiosity, opened the composter and looked inside, and a whole bunch of bugs had fallen out onto him. The guy put his hands forward and started using magic. Akira shouted loudly that it was a very long process. He would try to speed up time. Magic was so convenient. The boy said that the temperature had risen and there was a strong smell. Akira told the dolls to stir the compost there, and now he would speed up time again. The wolves were hunting wild boars. They ran after them quickly and happily. They were having a lot of fun. Koa grabbed the boar and cried out happily that they hadn't hunted so happily for a long time. Suddenly, he saw a bright light. He asked in surprise what it was. Was it really what he thought it was? Akira said with a smile that it was even better than he thought. The temperature was right, so he would leave it like that for now. He looked at the sky and saw a beautiful and big bird. He said in surprise, "What is it?" Akira shouted in shock. "Who is she? What is she doing? Is it really Karen?" The bird cried out happily that she was here. Karen quickly flew to sit on the boy's head. Akira noticed her claws and screamed in fear for her to stop. She couldn't. The bird started crying because he didn't want her to come closer. Akira awkwardly shouted that he was asking for forgiveness. He didn't mean that. He extended his hand to her. Akira hugged the bird and shouted happily that she had surprised him. He was so glad that she had returned unharmed and that she had become such a beauty. The bird accepted the praise with a smile. Koa came running screaming that it was Karen. The bird said that it was true. She was asking her master to take care of him. With her magical powers, she could not do more for him. Akira looked at the creature in surprise and asked what it was. Although it had wings, it was just floating. The guy thought, no, first he needed to remove the curse. Akira shouted loudly that he was calling for purification. The creature glowed brightly. Koa asked in surprise that it was really a water dragon. Karen answered that it was. The forest was truly being reborn. Koa thought that among the knights were the 5 elements that make up the forest and the divine beasts. The dragons had been protecting the forest from human attacks for many years, but soon all the dragons disappeared. Koa told the bird that, however, if the water dragon came, the waters of the forest would become beautiful again. Karen happily replied that she thought so too. She hoped so. The wolf said that they greatly influence the state of flora and fauna. If the dragons regain their strength, the forest will immediately come to life. Karen said that she promises King Koa Fenrir that she will find the other dragons and bring them to their lord. Koa replied that given her mobility, he had no choice but to entrust her with this task, Phoenix Karen, she could leave the master's protection to him. Karen said she didn't think he would need it. Koa said, whatever. Akira cried out happily that the creature was such a beautiful blue. The boy continued to say that he was fluffy, like a ball of yarn. Akira asked with interest what kind of creature it was, why it looked like that. Karen awkwardly replied that she didn't know. Koa said it was definitely a water dragon. Akira said with a smile that it felt so nice to the touch, like a fluffy thing. The creature flew up into the air happily. Akira asked with a smile what then he could call his fluffy. The creature began to flap its wings more vigorously. Koa joyfully shouted that it was so great, the master gave the water dragon a name. Karen laughed and shouted, Fluffy, that sounds so good. Akira smiled and said, I hope he likes it. The guy looked at the wolves. Akira said that Shion and the others had returned. He always wondered how they could carry more prey than them. The wolf happily dragged the boar to another place. He happily ran up to the guy and happily shouted that there was a big win again today. Akira asked in surprise that Shion wasn't in the water, he was sure he was swimming. Akira looked at his friends and thought that pukas and birds grow at the same time mysterious creatures. The guy awkwardly said that sometimes wolves swim in other worlds. He walked up to the prey the wolves had brought and thought that he seemed to have improved his skills lately. Akira told the wolf that he was such a good hunter. The guy stroked Karen and said happily that Karen had also returned after a long absence, so they should cook her a lot of meat. He cut up a lot of meat. Akira sighed tiredly and said that he was already used to this kind of work after all this, although he did not want to eat them. The guy took out a stone and asked in surprise what kind of stone was near the heart. Akira took out a few more stones and asked that he was sick with something, where the stones came from. He looked more closely, and there were more stones. The guy carefully examined the stone. He said that it seemed that they were not in all the animals, but perhaps they were in the ones he had caught. Akira shouted loudly that he was calling for purification. The boy looked at the stone in his hand and said that nothing happened. He thought it wasn't related to the curse. Akira smiled and confidently said that nothing, it didn't matter now. The dolls made a basin. Akira laughed happily and said that he really wanted to try something like that. He made a stovetop out of silver ore. The boy continued to say that he would put in a few rounded stones and they would be ready to work. Akira thought that the stones from the Rocky Mountains were easy to work with and the magic that was cast on them lasted longer. He went on to say that they also seemed heat-resistant. He hoped they would make a barbecue. Akira shouted that he had to imagine charcoal and now heat. The guy happily said that next time they could put the food on a gold ore skewer. Akira made a shash-like and put it on the new device to cook. He looked at Karen, who was already drooling in anticipation of her food. Akira said that he always fried food like this, but the shape was important too. He asked the bird to wait a little, it was almost ready. Akira said with a smile that Karen should know that the master and his family have been grilling meat for a while now. They should leave the raw meat for Koa and Suri. He turned his head and saw Koa, who was looking at him happily. Akira asked in surprise that he had only eaten their intestines. The wolf licked his lips, and the boy said that he understood everything. Akira wondered if Fluffy would be okay with meat. He would add some salt and lemon for himself. The boy happily bit off a piece of meat. He said with a smile that it was so delicious. He would need to think about kitchen utensils. The wolves surrounded the boy and began to eat the raw meat. Akira said with a smile that he also needed sauce and many other interesting things. He looked at the stones and said that, by the way, this stone, it looks like a stone, but he wonders if it is possible to transmit magic power through it. He released some magic and the stone immediately accepted it. Akira shouted in shock, wow, the magic power spread instantly. He thought that, at the moment, the stone on the Rocky Mountain was the one that was most conducive to magical power, and that was the one he was able to use the most. Akira continued to reason that it was obvious that the effect would weaken once the magic power given to him was used up. He was in a hurry when one day the toilet cleaner stopped working. The guy said they should see if they could use it for something too, infusing more and more magic power. It seems like he can store quite a lot. Akira looked at the stone in the sun and screamed in surprise that it was so cool, it changed color. Transparent green, it looks like a precious stone. He asked excitedly that the other stones were the same. Akira said that there were stones of green-red color, dark red, and light blue. It all depends on the type of demon. The guy went on to say that it was different from other stones because once it changed color, it no longer had magic. They were beautiful, but he didn't know what to do with them. Akira said hesitantly that maybe he could get a decent amount for them, but he had no one to bargain with. The wolf jumped up and down happily. The boy asked Koa in surprise what happened. The wolf sighed and started using magic. Akira looked at him in shock and excitedly shouted that it was magic. He of course assumed that he would be able to use it, but why is that? The wolf threw the stone. Akira asked what he was doing with the red stone. Koa began to release more magic. He looked at the boy intently. Akira gave him another stone, saying, "Okay." The guy thought nervously that, no, he sincerely does not understand what he wants to say. He needs to quickly understand what is what. Akira asked if it is possible that he uses this stone to double the power. He took one stone in his hands and said that he would try it. Akira took a glass and shouted loudly that he was calling for water. The glass quickly filled with water that it began to pour out and splash. The boy shouted happily, "Wow." Akira thought that he had received an unexpectedly useful item. He would think about how to use it later. The boy noticed Suri and said that he was glad he was back. The ant showed the vegetables that grow in the ground and said that he brought a lot of things for the master. Akira took the vegetable in his hands and happily asked that he could eat it all. The ants looked at the boy expectantly. Suri shouted that, for example, he could just bite off this. These roots taste more piquant together with meat. He begs the gentleman to try it. Akira put all the vegetables in the bag and said that he was grateful, but he was not hungry yet. The ant said excitedly, "No, how so?" The guy left saying that first they would create a field. Surprised, Suri asked what the gentleman was doing now and where he was going. The spider asked with a laugh what he didn't like. Akira approached the dolls holding the hose. He asked in shock when they did it. Akira took the tool in his hands and said that thanks to the little ants that dig it up, it would be a piece of cake. The guy went on to say that first they would need to mix the compost they made into the soil and then till it, but in reality he was only helping with the composting, so he didn't know how to grow anything. Akira said he should try. Once the kidney is ready, a hole needs to be made. The guy tried it and made it and asked what it should look like. They plowed the entire field. Akira said that he thought that was enough. They should cut the potato-like tubers in half and plant them. The boy picked up the strange vegetable and asked what it was. Akira said that this one looked like he might be cursed, but he wondered if he was okay. The ant brought another piece of vegetables and shouted happily that he had a sharp eye. Suri continued to say that these fruits swell when they are soaked in water and then become so delicious. The guy said with a smile that he would have to trust Suri. Akira picked up a hoe and said that they should have piled them higher so that they would drain better. The guy looked at the perfect beds they had made. He said happily that it was funny. He thought he was going to start a vegetable garden, but it turned out to be a farm. He planted probably about 100 tubers, and the field still seemed half empty. Akira asked where he could have made a mistake. Suri asked in surprise why the master buried them again when they had spent all their efforts to collect them. Koa said that was strange. Karen cried out happily that she didn't know, but he must be thinking deeper. Akira said that it was good that he planted them, but what season is it now? It's warmer here than it was when he came here. The guy added that these eternal worries, and also weeds. Akira thought that, well, he would make some more stone dolls. He also made some more magic stones. Akira took the stone in his hands and said that all that was required to care for the crops was weeding, watering, fertilizing, and pest control. Therefore, he thought it would be useful if they could use magic on the stone dolls as well. The boy thought that since yesterday he had tried several things. He had found that red stones enhanced fire magic, and blue stones enhanced water magic. Akira looked at the doll. He said he doesn't know if that makes it usable. The green stones, he thinks they are related to nature, and the clear ones, he wonders what they are. Akira shouted happily that now you can add a little magic to each doll. The new dolls looked at the guy carefully. He said with a smile that he was having a good morning. The boy shouted loudly for them to get to work. He would leave them to work in the fields. Akira and his friends came to the lake. The boy happily said that the lake he had cleaned last time was completely clean. Why a lake? Akira said. They needed soy sauce, but they couldn't get soybeans. If they had slaves, they could make fish sauce. He went on to say that he was sure that what they said on TV was that you just mix salt with fish and ferment it. It's a bit unusual, but he likes fish sauce. Akira looked at Fluffy and said with a smile that he looks good today. He is trying to tell him something, but he can't understand what exactly. He got out his fishing rod and shouted that it was good. He had made himself a fishing hook, so maybe it would work. He had already told the wolf that they were going to catch fish with it. Akira awkwardly added that the fish, that is, dinner. Suddenly, he felt the fishing rod being pulled. He screamed in surprise what was happening. A huge fish jumped out of the lake. The boy said in shock that it was gigantic. the fish jumped onto the shore in front of Akira and his friends. Fluffy happily began to fly around their catch. Akira thought that they had immediately received about 10 times more than they had planned. It was not what it seemed. He smiled and told Fluffy that he was grateful to him, he was good at fishing. The guy said maybe they could try fish sauce. He'd make some when they got home, and the rest he'd fry with salt. He hadn't eaten fish in ages. At this time, bad times came to the castle. Mizurost and his soldiers came to the king to report what had happened. The king's assistant said in surprise, "What happened? Let him repeat it." Genmilza watched as the knights entered the castle. He thought that the Fourth Order had returned rather quickly. The man noticed Mizurost's tired and dejected face. Genmilza asked in surprise what had happened, since not even a month had passed. Suddenly, a knight entered his office, shouting that he was asking for forgiveness. The leaders of the knights were ordered to immediately gather in the audience hall. The advisor asked Mizurost what it meant. They found the reason for the damage to the magic stone. The man thought irritably that he was a warrior, and he followed all orders for the sake of his country. He continued to reason that he was ready to give even his life, but he would not kill people without any reason. Mizero said that this is why. The man said that as soon as they stepped into the forest, a huge wall of light suddenly fell upon them. By the time he came to his senses, everyone was already fighting. Mizurost nervously continued to say that, in addition, the strengthened monsters of their country had come against them. The situation was so stalemate that they could not make the right decision. The advisor angrily asked that the slaves had escaped. That is, they had not even died, but had simply run away. Mizurost quietly answered that they had. The advisor shouted that this was some kind of nonsense. The king rose from his throne and walked past his commanders. The advisor screamed in fear. What was the king doing? He thought in disbelief that this simply could not be happening. The advisor shouted for the Fourth Order to be ready for further orders. Mizurost looked at him in shock. Everyone began to leave the main hall. Gamel said goodbye, saying that Mizurost was a coward. Mizurost and his assistants sighed wearily. Genmilse put his hand on his shoulder and said that he was glad to see that he was okay. Mizurost said that he didn't know what would happen now. The man asked what had happened in that forest. Mizurost said that everything looked the same, but it was terrible. He went on to say that it seemed as if the forest itself was rejecting them. He honestly thought he was dead when a huge wall of light passed through him. The slaves simply ran away, and the soldiers stood their ground. Mizurost said he had no idea what was going on. Genmilse wondered if it was a warning. He asked if it was more than just a forest ring. Who was he? Mizurost excitedly asked what he meant by it being the forest lord. Genmilse replied that if he had such power, he would have driven them away much earlier. The man said he was right. Genmilse said that perhaps someone more powerful than just the Forest King had appeared. Mizurost looked at him in surprise. The king walked along the corridors and thought angrily that this was nonsense. The slaves had escaped. This simply could not be. It was possible only in one case. The slave's coat of arms, strengthened by a magic stone, was annulled. He said that it was unthinkable. The magical stones had been strengthened by sacrifices for hundreds of years. The king looked out the window and thought that the guards protecting him and his country were working properly. The man thought that the mutation of the enhanced magical beast that was released into the forest, they want to say that the magic stone revived the instincts that were distorted by it. The king continued to reason that with the help of the stone, one can seize all the power of the forest, and then one can become the king of the world. He will do everything that the gods told him. He took away the magic of the forest and limited its animals as much as possible. The man said that for decades now they had been unable to do anything against them. One more step, and it would all be over. The king threw his sword at the slave and killed him. He screamed angrily that something was wrong with him. He had enough. He ordered the forest to be burned to the ground, so that nothing remained. Akira picked up the knife and shouted happily that he would be able to make the fish sauce he had always dreamed of. He was going to remove the head, guts, and even blood, and then cut up the cleaned fish. The guy looked at the pieces of fish and awkwardly said that the silver knife cuts perfectly. All that was left was to add salt, but salt was very valuable, so he had to proceed from the amount they had. Akira said he thought about 20% would be enough. The guy grated the fish and said you need to put the salted fish in the jar so that there is no space between them. He continued to say, all the way to the top. He wasn't sure if he needed to sprinkle salt on top as well. Akira tied the jar and said to store it in a cool, dark place for a year or two. The boy smiled and thought that this is where the magic happens. Akira said he would let it sit for 3 months. It looks a little mushy, or maybe that's its natural cooking process, another 6 months. Koa asked with a smile what the gentleman had come up with this time. Suri replied that he didn't know, but it smelled delicious. Akira said with a smile that he felt a stinky and unique aroma. Was it really a success? The guy said that now he was moving on to the next step, pouring the sauce through the stuffed cloth. It turned out a beautiful light brown color. Akira shouted with a smile that he had a precious drop. Quite salty, but it tasted delicious. He would stop there, and now it was time to cook. The guy went to fry some meat. Akira said that he froze the rest of the fish and they were going to grill it today. He had been dreaming about it for a long time. He was sure that Karen would be home soon, so he would cook some meat for her too. Akira said that when the dish is ready, you need to turn it over and pour fish sauce on it. The guy poured the sauce on it and happily shouted that it smelled so good. The guy tasted the dish and screamed with delight. He cried and thought that salt alone was not enough, but the taste that arises during the fermentation process burns, and the smell is even more piquant, indescribable. It is simply delicious. Akira said it was delicious. He wanted white rice. It was totally worth all his trouble. The animals crowded around him, waiting for him to share. The boy laughed and shouted that no, it was a salt variety, so they wouldn't like it. He was absolutely sure of it. Akira looked at the wolf's wild eyes and thought that he was scared. He said okay, just one drop. Akira took a piece of meat and said he needs to cook another piece of meat for Karen. It's really scary. Suri asked excitedly that if it was that scary, maybe he wouldn't. Akira replied that he didn't know if Suri could handle a steak on the grill. The guy added that he should eat more slowly. It was hot. Akira noticed the spider reaching for the meat. He screamed in shock. What was he doing now? The guy finally sat down to eat. He happily said that the fish was so delicious. Akira looked at Chai in fear. The wolf was shocked that wolves, golems, and insects were eating the fish. The guy tiredly thought that someone should stop him. Night fell and Akira fell on the bed. The boy said that he was so tired, the only comfort for him was his soft futon. He wondered how the little devils were doing. He would check on them tomorrow. They looked like a farm building. A doll with a shirt came up to Akira. The guy asked in surprise what it was. He put it on himself and excitedly said that his clothes had improved significantly. The ant and the golems worked together on the farm. Akira said with a smile that he would help them. The doll quickly shook its head, indicating that they did not need help. The boy approached the dolls who were working with skins and asked them what they had to do. They showed that they didn't need help either. The same thing happened when he approached the dolls who were working with boards. Akira asked in fear, "What, is he useless?" A spider and an ant came to him with stones. Suri joyfully shouted that he wanted him to pour magic power into it. The spider screamed, "No, in this please, first in his." Akira said with a smile that he was glad that he was asked for something. He awkwardly asked what he should do. Akira looked at the stones they brought and thought that they were emitting magical power. The boy awkwardly looked into the eyes of the spider and the ant, who were waiting for something from him. Silence reigned in the air. Akira touched the stones and said that he wondered if they wanted him to pour magic power into them. Suddenly, the stone began to burst. The guy excitedly shouted that he was asking for forgiveness. He poured too much. It turned out that these were not stones, but eggs, from which small ants and spiders began to crawl out. The spider and the ant screamed loudly, which is cool. Akira looked at the small ants and spiders in shock and then screamed loudly. Akira and his friends were walking through the forest. The boy said in a sad voice that he had done wrong by screaming. He thought awkwardly that he was not very knowledgeable about insects and did not think that these were eggs. He went on to reason that if it was a centipede, he probably would have blown them away. Akira noticed the spider on the wolf's back and thought it was normal that they were riding on tea. Akira petted Koa and said with a smile that he was glad that he met him. The boy asked Chai what he wanted him to pet him to. The wolf turned away from him. Akira awkwardly said that he was rejected. The guy asked Chai with interest that maybe he was disliked because he spends a lot of time with Koa. Chai was embarrassed and thought he wanted his fur scratched. Koa asked the wolf if he was jealous of his master. Chai shouted loudly that it was not true. Koa thought it was so cute. Akira smiled and thought, "Tea is so cute." They continued their way through the forest. Suddenly, they stopped in front of a cave. Akira said in surprise that there were a lot of caves in this forest. They went inside, and the guy said that he was wondering if there would be anything this time. They went deeper into the cave. Animals covered in black liquid ran out at them. Koa growled angrily at them so that they would move away from the man. Akira stared at the beasts. At this time, in the castle, dozens of soldiers and mages lined up in front of the king. The advisor said loudly that 25 mages would accompany the 2nd and 5th squads to subdue the monsters. There were several people standing in a row, some were in armor, and some had a hood on their head. Ganmulze thought excitedly that it was because of the report published the other day. Gamul stretched his arms and smiled broadly. Cole said loudly that until now he had shown mercy to the forest animals. He had even given the honor of serving their country. He continued to say that his mercy was the last rebellion, so he would burn the forest to the ground. The knights shouted joyfully. The boy asked that they would be entrusted with such a big role. His friend grinned and replied that his hands were already itching. Ganmulze thought intensely that he wanted to burn him. Mages certainly had great power. Besides, the 5th squad was full of madmen who loved to fight monsters. The man continued to reason that this time, their opponent was something more terrible than the king of the forest. Akiro and Koa fought monsters that had gone mad. Several monsters moved forward. The guy said that he was okay because he had set up the barrier in time. The guy said they looked like Chai, maybe they were kids. There was a spider on the wolf's back. The wolf was alert and ready to attack. T angrily screamed that they did not recognize him. He asked them to wake up. The fur on the wolf's back stood on end. They were ready to attack. The animals growled angrily at him. Chai ran up to Akiro and excitedly shouted that he begged the master to help them. Akiro shouted for them to stop moving. The animals stopped as the boy had ordered. He joyfully shouted that it was good. Having created the image of a cage, he succeeded. Light began to fall on the wolves, and the animals were very frightened from surprise. Akiro smiled and told Chai not to worry. The boy spoke to start the cleansing. The curse began to leave the wolves. He cried out happily that it worked. The animals began to cough and breathe heavily. Akiro began to heal them with his power. The wolves remained unconscious, but now they were not in any danger. The boy looked at them happily. Blood began to flow from the wolf's mouth. The guy approached one of the wolves and put his hands on it. He began to heal the wounded wolf. The wolves gradually began to come to their senses, and Akiro, noticing this, began to smile sincerely and rejoice at the healing. Akiro said that these children were Chai's friends. They were so skinny. The boy thought angrily that he could not forgive the source of the curse for this. The meeting continued in the castle. The king joyfully shouted to the knights that the kings of the forest should know the emperor's terror. The knights raised their hands and shouted loudly in support of the king. The king raised his hands up and began to cast a spell, and a large column of light rose up and headed towards the sky. The dolls worked on the farm. Akiro thought that a few days after that he was asked to triple the size of the agricultural corps. He continued to reason that before he could come to his senses, a small lake appeared next to the field. Akiro and the others came to the lake. Fluffy happily flew over the water. Akiro looked at the ants and said that they dug him up together. It was just amazing. Fluffy started showing various tricks with water. He made balls of water and threw them at Akira's feet. Fluffy started to hit the tree. Akiro awkwardly asked what was going on. He wanted him to cut the tree down. He wanted to widen the lake. They walked along the lake a little more. The boy entered the house and said tiredly that he had returned home. He had done all he could. The spiders crawled up to him and looked at him with concern. Akiro asked if something had happened in the food warehouse. The guy went down the stairs and looked at the storage. He said that even the shelves that were empty were filled. He noticed the golems carrying food. Akiro said that was understandable. Now they could use what they had gathered in the fields and then make preserves for the winter. The guy added that they needed to expand the room. Akiro used magic and said that now they would keep the temperature cold here. Dolls ran into the warehouse with boards. They quickly built additional shelves. Akiro screamed in shock that they had expanded it in the blink of an eye. The golems grabbed the products and began to fill the shelves with them. The boy took the vegetables and said with a smile that he could. The doll jumped and shook her head, indicating that she shouldn't do that. Akiro and Koa went into the forest. The guy said in surprise what happened. They had already reached the barrier. So 2 hours from home, I wonder if he could expand it even more. That would be nice. Akiro looked at the sky and noticed a huge dragon. Koa growled at him angrily. The wolf shouted loudly that it was very dangerous. Akiro heard a noise. He turned around and was surprised at what he saw. There was a dragon nearby, which began to open its mouth wide and roar. Suddenly, Karen appeared and shouted that she was able to return earlier today. Inside the master's barrier, everything was still so calm. The bird noticed the dragon and said that it was a wyvern. It was rare to meet one. Karen called out to her master. The bird thought that the wyvern's tough skin made it a dangerous opponent that couldn't be hit by volume attacks. Akiro thought uncomfortably that he had been training in case of an attack, and did it reflexively. He hadn't thought it would turn out like this. He asked with a smile that it was something he could eat. Koa laughed happily. Akira waved at Karen and shouted that he was welcome home. Why was she standing there? They all went back home to get something to eat. The wolves each took a piece of meat. Koa met Chai and shouted that he should eat too. The wolf awkwardly replied that he was asking for forgiveness and thanking him for the meat he had brought. Akira used divine punishment. The boy thought irritably that he did not know what would happen and where the source of the curse was. At this time, the king was plotting something. The king tried to approach but was thrown back. He thought in shock what had just happened. It couldn't be, but he had been attacked. It was so stupid how it had happened. He sat down on the chair and said that he was surprised that the king was attacked. Mizurost asked that it was a pity that he was not there, but he was pushed away by the barrier protecting the king, wasn't it? Gamilze replied that it seemed as if lightning had struck right in front of the king. Mizurost shouted that, as expected, the king's barrier was very strong. He asked that he finally sent an army into the forest. Ganmilze said yes, but he used the help of magicians, erected many barriers, and locked himself in a stone room. Mizurost asked in surprise that the invincible king was acting timidly. Ganmilze said that he knew that this country had never been attacked from anywhere. Moreover, the barrier protecting the country had not been broken yet. Mizurost asked him in shock what he meant. Ganmilze replied that it meant the attack had gone beyond the barrier. The man looked at his friend worriedly. At this time, Akira was walking down the street not far from home and humming a melody. Animals were walking next to him. Akira smiled and told Koa that he was glad they looked okay. Now they could have dinner too. He asked the golem to disassemble it, but wasn't it too big? He came out into the clearing and saw a pile of meat. Akira shouted in surprise that the golems had done it so quickly. They grabbed the skin and dragged it away to get to work. Akira was cooking meat on the fire, and his accompanying animals were sitting nearby, licking their lips and wanting to eat. Akira tasted his creation and shouted joyfully that it tasted like white rice. He wanted rice with thick eggs so much, he would eat it with pleasure. The guy said that this lizard didn't taste like chicken, he wants fried chicken. Come to think of it, you can wait for the oil from the camellia seed. Is there such a seed in this world? The wolves grabbed a piece of meat when a bird flew up to them. Karen screamed loudly that it was the meat the master had prepared for him. The wolves replied that their portions were too small. Akira thought with tears in his eyes that he was back in reality again, a little sad. The animals began to fight fiercely for food. The next day came. Akira sat down at the table and said that fried chicken didn't seem possible yet, but fried vegetables were also very tasty. Akira tried it and said sadly that it was something completely different. What could you get oil from? He ate the seeds and cried out loudly that it was so bitter. The spider and the ant brought him more food. Akira smiled and said that he was grateful for them bringing more. He cut the fruit and took out the seeds. Akira tried them and said that the taste was familiar. The guy asked with interest where they got this fruit from. They brought Akira and his friends to the place where these fruits grow. Akira and his accompanying animals stopped and looked ahead in surprise. Akira had a belt hanging on his chest. There were berries hanging on the bushes. Akira looked at the white wolf in surprise, then he thoughtfully put his hand to his face. Ganmilze added that it was probably because the king had said he was going to burn the forest. Akira had said he wanted to expand it 3 times as big as before, no, about 5 times as big. The boy said with a smile that there was a place in the distance that interested him. The wolf asked with interest what the gentleman was going to do. Akira replied that they would first determine the action of the barrier and clean it. The king cried out joyfully that the barrier would now protect him. This was the last evil attack on him. Gamilze asked if this meant that someone had the power to destroy this country. Suddenly, a ball appeared above the stone. The people in cloaks looked away in fear. The king's face was distorted with horror. The magical symbols on the floor began to glow. A magical clot formed above the light stone, from which cloaks of energy emanated. People in cloaks screamed and ran in different directions. The magic stone darkened in an instant. Sparks emanated from it. The king looked in shock at the stone, which was full of a curse. Meanwhile, Akira's face was red. He thought with a smile that now he was good, he was satisfied. Koa was in the air above the forest. He said that he didn't think he would be able to cover it all in one day. A few days ago, a very strong wind blew. The wolf asked loudly what kind of force it was. Koa cried out joyfully that the sign of the barrier that was still felt close had disappeared. Spider asked with interest what had happened to the master. Wolf looked at the golem and thought that everything was fine with him. Akira shouted that he was back. The boy asked curiously why they were all gathered together. Koa said that he seemed to be fine, having erected a barrier of such a scale, should he say, as expected. Akira shouted happily that it was so cool. He thought that when he got home, a wooden deck had been built. He went inside the house to see how the renovation was going. The guy said happily that there was a sliding door now, how smoothly it opened and closed. Doors in every room, it was a dream come true. He looked at the golem who was pulling him by the leg of his pants. Akira asked that he needed to touch the wall. The golems shook their heads, saying that he was right. The guy touched the wall and a cube fell out of it. The guy asked that they use magic, it was convenient. He said with a smile that it was good. Finally it was time to extract oil. Akira came to the table and shouted joyfully that this was a juicer that worked on magic power. The guy thought he squeezed out a small amount of oil to test. It looked great. The juicer needs to be improved for large-scale production. Akira tasted it and thought happily that fried eggplants were so delicious. The wolves surrounded him. Akira gave the wolves and spiders some vegetables so that they could taste them. T and other wolves approached Akira. He said with a smile that his friends had recovered, thank him very much. One of the wolves asked if this man was really okay. He asked if they wanted some. The wolves quickly started gobbling up the food. Akira thought with a smile that they seemed to like vegetables. The boy happily said that yes, he should name them. Akira said that their names were now Chaya, Chata, the one with white spots, Cheryu, the female, China, Shacha, Chami, the one with red eyes, Himecha. The golems behind him were whispering about something. The boy proudly said that all the names have Cha in them. Since they are Cha's family, he is quite smart. The doll led Akira somewhere. She showed that their house now has a balcony. Akira sat down in the chair and then began to enjoy the beautiful world. The guy said that he could cook fried food, but he still needed an iron frying pan. The guy thoughtfully asked how they could find iron ore. They didn't have a magnet or anything, but a magnet. He had a white wallet with a magnet on it. Akira was walking through the forest. He thought with a smile that every time he went outside he was looking for iron ore. They entered a new cave and approached the crystals. The guy touched the magnet and said that although he was just randomly poking the magnet, he was glad he remembered the clasp on his wallet. Akira asked if it was a volcanic zone or something like that. It's a pity he couldn't see everything in detail. They want it for the 5th day already, as this is a cave in a row, he's already confused. The guy looked at the finds and said sadly that he had found so much ore, but not the one he needed. Akira came out of the cave and said disappointedly that he was a little tired. He noticed Koa looking happy and said that the game they had hunted along the way had increased, so it was time to go back. They headed home. Suddenly, Akira stopped and said that there was another cave. They went inside and the guy said that it was so beautiful. The guy into the walls and noticed that a lot of animals were stuck in them. Akira said it was ice, but he wasn't cold at all. There was a turquoise squirrel inside, it was alive. The guy put his hands on the unusual stone in which the animals were locked, then the stone began to crack gradually. After a while, the ice began to crack gradually and the squirrel escaped from captivity. Akira looked ahead with alarm. Akira saw the animal and shouted that it was so cute. The boy excitedly thought that he should be more careful because there was a wolf here, although he didn't seem to be interested in the squirrel. Akira looked at Shy and thought he was wary. Koa asked him, displeased, what he was going to do with the little animal. The squirrel ran up to the ice blocks and began scratching them with its paws. Akira freed the other animals. After a while, Akira was sitting in a pile of squirrels that were happily crawling on him. Akira thought uncomfortably that there were too many of them. T began to cry and screamed hysterically that he needed to help the master. Akira was sweating. Koa growled angrily and shouted for the squirrels to run away from the master. Akira laughed and said that he was grateful to him. To be honest, he was a little tired of it. The first squirrel he saved climbed onto his shoulder. The boy thought with a smile that the squirrel was alone, so it looked cuter. They left the cave and headed home. Akira said disappointedly that he had visited 4 places today, but there was no result. Koa said that he could not find any ore veins. The guy replied that he had plenty of time and he would be patient. The guy noticed a cave and said that this is the cave where they found Chaya and her friends. There are 15 minutes left to the house. By the way, did they look here? He thinks it is useless. Akira put a magnet on the wall of the cave. Akira fell to his knees and thought in shock that she had been right around the corner all this time. Koa asked in shock what happened. Karen flew to them saying that today she also did not find dragons. Koa said that she returned. The master also just returned. The bird looked at the guy happily. She noticed a squirrel and thought in shock what kind of little animal it was. Why was it with the gentleman? The squirrel noticed the bird and quickly began to run away. She climbed a high pole. Karen awkwardly said that she felt she had acted a little immaturely. Suri said that she had done it before she had time to realize it, but he still didn't understand. Akira put his finger to his face and thought about the many animals he had with a smile on his face. Akira found himself on the ground, with many little people sitting in front of him, looking at Akira and not taking their eyes off him. The boy asked in surprise what was going on. He came to the garden and sighed in surprise. Akira asked hesitantly that hadn't it only been 2 months since they started farming. The boy pulled out a giant potato, then melons, and finally daikon. Akira said in shock that they were all so big. He cooked them. Akira said they'll put aside the one that's spicy but has a light taste, and the one that's very sweet but too sharp. If everything works out, maybe they'll be able to increase the amount of seasoning. The spider cried out happily, surprisingly, this root is so sweet. Suri said that he did not expect the things he collected to be so big. He should eat more of this. Akira asked in surprise what they were all doing in the yard. Koa and the Soatlians were happily drawing something on the ground. Akira thought that before he knew it, a grand map of hope for development had been created. Akira blushed and shouted in surprise that he was asking them to wait a minute for what they were doing. He thought happily that soon he would make a frying pan from iron ore. The wolf thought that he had been struggling with the invisible enemy for a long time when his friends, who had been swallowed up by the darkness, attacked him. He had almost lost himself and was preparing for the end. He continued to reason that when he understood everything, a few friends remained. The wolf asked that this place was built by one of the kings. He was told that they could hide in these depths. The wolf said that they could rest a little, and then they would fight the people to the end. Suddenly, it became dark. The wolf opened his eyes and wondered in surprise that he had lost consciousness, but where was he? He stood up and wondered if it was a healing wind or a magical force. His body felt lighter, his mind became clear. They were asked if they were alive. The wolf answered that they were. The wolf went into the forest and caught a rodent. He thought happily that he could finally hunt small prey. He was grateful to the healing wind. The miasma flooding the forest disappears. He wondered uncertainly if the threat was gone. A wolf came up to him and asked if he could go hunting too. The wolf cried out happily that yes, he could help him. He said that he hoped he could help his friends a little. He heard a strange sound and screamed in fear. Something was approaching the entrance. Everyone who could move should follow it. They saw big wolves. He shouted that King Fenrir was there and the direwolf with him, but they were too big. The wolf asked if that was a spider. They had never heard of spiders with a thread. The wolf noticed Akira and shouted that there was a man there who needed to be killed. Koa and Chai growled at them angrily, telling them not to dare approach the boy. The wolves screamed in fear. Akira was shocked to think that Koa and T had grown so big. He spent some time exploring the area. He studied the plants that could be grown and made a frying pan through trial and error. The guy continued to reason that he went to explore the cave he had found earlier for a change. They went into the cave together with a spider who was descending with the help of a thread. Akira screamed in surprise that the spider had learned to use threads. He almost fell into a hole, but T saved him with magic. The boy screamed in shock that T had magic. Akira looked at the wolves and thought uncertainly that they were changing, evolving. He looked at the frightened wolves and thought that deep in the cave they had found them. The boy told them that they had already given up. He knew how they felt. Akira touched them and said that he was calling for cleansing, removing the curse, and then healing. The wolf excitedly said that this was the magical power that cleansed and filled the forest. Koa said that this gentleman cleansed the forest and restored their powers. The wolf asked what this man was Lord. He was shocked to think that the king of the forest, Fenrir, called him Lord. The beast looked at the happy guy and wondered what kind of pure magic power this was. The wolf thought happily that his heart was filled with love for his master. Akira noticed the wolf waving its tail from side to side. He thought in surprise that it was a dog. It was smaller than Chai on the first day. Akira continued to reason that he begs him to stay like this forever, otherwise everyone looks down on him. Akira returned home with new and old friends. The boy looked at his property. He said with a smile that he was not used to such sizes. He noticed trees that were not there when he left. Akira ran there shouting that the field behind the house had turned into a forest. There was nothing this morning. The spider shouted joyfully that the master had returned home. The spider shouted that, on the golem's orders, he had collected and planted the fruit trees that the master wanted. It was all thanks to his family. The ants said that it was nothing of the sort. They had worked several times harder. The wolves thought in fear, what madness, the insects are so big. Akira noticed how they began to faint. He thought that they were in shock from what they saw. Akira and his friends went to the forest again. The boy shouted joyfully that they now had their own orchard. Akira thought excitedly, but how did they plant them in this half a day? They returned home. The golems collected the fruits and brought them to Akira. The boy put them in pots and said with a smile that wine could be made from grapes or something similar to them. The guy picked up the frying pan and thought that after a month he could make a cast iron frying pan. It was a long time. He gave names to the stones and ores that served him until now. He went on to say that he called it the universal stone. Parts of his house and golems were made of it. It was easy to work with and had the property of retaining magical power. Akira thought that imitation iron or just iron was difficult to process, but the utensils he really wanted were made. Silver and gold ores are the most durable. He noticed that the fluffy one was acting strangely. He gave Akira an empty jar. Akira asked if something had happened to him. The boy filled the jar with stones and thought that a magic stone is a stone that increases magic power. They can be found in monsters. Akira diligently peeled and grated food into the pan. Akira wrung out the cloth and poured the excess water into the grass. He said that the vegetable was very similar to potatoes and he would try to extract starch from it. He had seen it done on TV and it was easy. Akira returned to the kitchen and thought that he would repeat the process 2 more times. What he got should be put on a plate and left to dry. He touched the substance and thought that it worked. The guy looked at the golems and thought that the new ones were resting upstairs and everyone else was outside, right? Recently houses were built for them, now they are all there. Akira thought sadly that he was lonely, but everyone had grown too big and the golems could no longer expand 4 floors. The boy took out the rabbit meat and put it on a plate. He said he would rub salt into the rabbit meat, dip the meat in starch and fry it in a cast iron skillet, which is just amazing for frying meat. Akira put the meat on a plate and shouted happily that now was the time to try it. The boy took a bite and thought in admiration that it was so delicious. Akira picked up a piece of the cooked food with his chopsticks and tasted it. Then he shouted that it tasted sweet and rich. Akira took the piece in his mouth. The next moment, a spider appeared in front of him. He screamed in surprise. Where did it come from? The spider took the piece of meat, and the guy said that he should not tell anyone about it. The dark-haired guy took a knife in his hands and began to cut the food. He gradually began to throw the cut food into the water. Akira stood in front of a pot of food that was on the fire. Then he took a spoon and began to stir the water, which turned purple. Akira smiled and held a pot of food in his hands. Then he took a large spoon and began to stir the food. A golem came to him. The lizard hid in a hole and watched what they were doing outside. Koa smelled it and licked his lips. He said that the master had started cooking. The lizard, who was hiding under the rocks, watched the boys with fascination. Chai said that he had never smelled such a sweet smell before. Koa raised his head and asked Karen if there was any news. The bird excitedly replied that after increasing the barrier, she had only explored half of it, and they were resting here. Akira was holding plates of cooked food in both hands. He heard a noise and looked away in surprise. Koa proudly replied that he was protecting the master's peace. Akira came out with the roasted meat and told them with a smile that they could start eating. The animals cried out happily. The guy laid it out and said that now that they had sugar they could eat red meat off a plate. Skria shouted that he didn't know what it was, but it was delicious. Koa ate his portion and shouted to the spider that it was too delicious, he should give him his share. Karen cried and said that her hard work was rewarded. It is not easy to fly through the miasma and look for the dragon. Suri said that he actually felt a strong dragon presence in the air lately, but it was hard to find. Karen cried out happily that it was true, she was getting lost and couldn't find it. Akira put food into his mouth one by one, and the animals that surrounded him closed their eyes in pleasure. Then they perked up. All the animals began to scream in fear. They were very surprised to see the earth dragon in front of them. They shouted that this was the earth dragon. Akira looked and said with a smile, what a cutie this was. How long had he been here? Fluffy happily flew up to him. Akira's face blushed and he said in surprise that they were really cute. How long had they been here? The lizard's face lit up and the fluffy one headed into the air. The dragon flew up and began to rejoice together with the fluffy one. Akira asked in surprise why he was flying, and they seemed to get along. The guy wondered with interest why he thought they were the same species. The dog sat nearby and watched them in shock. She wondered what kind of strange place and creature this was. The magicians gathered around the magic stone. The king shouted in disbelief that the barrier was fine. In the center of the magical symbols that were located on the floor, there was a magical stone. Around the magical stone stood people. They were dressed in dark robes with hoods. A grimace of anger appeared on the king's face. The king opened his mouth wide and began to shout loudly that the magicians must find out the reason for what happened within a month. One of the magicians had beads of sweat running down his face. He closed his eyes and bowed his head while he listened to the king scream. Several people dressed in robes were talking to each other. Next to them, on the floor, lay a girl. The girl had light hair and cat ears. The magician said without turning around that how many more lives should he give to restore the magic stone? This country is causing the wrath of the whole world, which is simply terrible. The other magicians looked at him in fear. The spider came down from the tree and said that recently his children began to manipulate the thread. Their main task is to maintain the fire and quickly kill enemies. He told his children that the Lord sent them an image of using the Nika every time he saw them. They tried to use it. You can catch your prey in it and it will not be able to escape. The spider continued to say that they could also set up a trap. He thought they had evolved a lot. The spider happily shouted that yes, they would try to do that. The gentleman had plenty of great ideas. Akiro came home with the dragons. He said that they now had a flying lizard. No, that's not true of course, it's too hot to think about that today. The guy said that it's actually a lizard and what names they give them. It's bright yellow, like a Tyrannosaurus rex, maybe Terra or Kukulkan. It also looks like a salamander, maybe Jormungand or Leviathan. Akiro said upset that there was no reaction, but he was a flying lizard. The beast began to quickly wave its tail. The guy asked in surprise what a hovering lizard was. Akiro thought he had given all the dogs new names without really thinking about it. Sauron, Onran, Ranki, Aimi, Aimu, Jaime. He could come up with a good name if he put his mind to it. The boy proudly said that the soft color of the fur was similar to the indigo color he had seen before. He could not make a mistake. The golems could not understand what the boy wanted. Akiro came to the river and dove into the water. He came up and shouted joyfully that it was such a nice feeling. It was so hot here, probably 40 degrees. Is it really so hot in this world in summer? The boy was swimming in the lake, and so was the lizard. Fluffy landed on his head, and Akira said that the river flowing through the forest was the best. The guy continued to say that he was surprised that they had directed the riverbed here, but the forest in the clearing was growing more and more. He noticed how wolves were jumping in the trees. Akira said that, even so, they continued to watch him. The guy waved his hand at them and thought that wolves were jumping on trees. This world is really amazing. Koa lay down tiredly on the ground. He said that the season that had disappeared for hundreds of years seemed to have returned. This is also the power of the Lord. Chai said that this is his first time, but is this really summer? Koa asked him with a smile what was hard for him to endure. He looked at the spider and said that he was doing just fine. Chai said that after all he was the master of hellfire. The spider asked that the Fenrir king could not stand such a temperature. Koa shouted in displeasure that nothing of the sort, he was enjoying the warmth after a long break. The spider said that maybe everything was fine with them, but didn't it affect the master? Koa said that he had thought about it. Akiro climbed out of the water and said that for some reason he felt dizzy. The guy asked with interest what he was sitting on. He looked at the strange creatures that the Fluffy was playing with. Akiro thought that they had eyes. Fluffy, he did it. They don't attack, so they are not enemies. The spider said that they were playing with the main spirits of water. The spirits love beautiful magic, but he had never seen so much. The master should be careful and not use too much magic. Akiro choked and coughed. The spider worriedly asked the Lord if something was wrong. The guy shouted that they shouldn't worry, everything was fine. He thought that this was really another world. They returned home and ate. Akiro awkwardly said that the meat and potatoes he had cooked in the morning had disappeared in an instant. Should he triple the amount of cooking, then he would need 3 or 5 more pots. All the animals were fighting over food. The boy told the golems that if they helped him with the cooking, he would be able to cook more and the quarrel could perhaps be settled. They would have to expand the cooking space. Akiro continued to say that they also needed to increase the power of the stove and do something about this heat. He thought tiredly that his head was spinning. The slaves lined up. The magician told the employee to have these 100 respond to the room with the magic stone. The magic stone can be restored with their help. The magician thought that, based on the state, they would simply increase their number. He remembered the face of the dying enemy and thought that, why did he remember that it was like that? He went on to say that they were always slaves. They were born to be slaves. They were temporary warriors, research material, or those who did the lowest paid jobs. The magician thought that in this country this was considered the norm, and previously anyone who objected was subjected to public execution. Now no one objects to it. The man continued to think that rather many people think that they are necessary for a rich life. That's what this country is like. Akira went to the river to rest a little in the water. The sun was high in the sky. Akira put his hands together and put his head on them. Akira was all wet, he was in the water, next to him was a fluffy thing. The boy raised his hand and said that he didn't seem to have a fever. Maybe it was because it was too hot to sleep. It was nice to be in the river, it seemed to free the soul. Akira looked up at the sky through the trees and thought that he couldn't stay here all the time, so he needed to think of ways to prevent the curse without leaving this river. The guy thought that he still didn't know if there was a civilization here. If we were talking about the curse, then weren't people the source of it? Maybe there were people here somewhere. Akira looked away and said that he felt like they weren't in the forest. Maybe this world was just forest. He shook his head and screamed that no, he was sure that people were supposed to be here. Please let them exist. What was a curse anyway? The slaves went to the room with the magic stone. Akira said that in Japan, curses are associated with the image of a specific person who curses. The entire forest here is cursed. The guy continued to reason that this was only his own idea of a curse. Is it possible that a curse could be connected to a place, for example, to spirits connected to the land? He looked at the lizard and shouted that no, it's unlikely. It's getting more and more fun, but the scariest thing is that clinging shadow. Cal and Karen were in a state when that shadow stuck to them. Akira thought they only needed a little cleansing. The others were almost possessed, a terrible curse. There is nothing good about curses. The wolves were running after their prey. Suddenly, Koa stopped and asked what it felt like. Akira said that when the owner of the body constantly absorbs, it is more like demonization than a curse. He said that in order to prevent the summoning of evil, something like a magic circle is needed. A magic circle, yes, he has no idea about it at all. Akira said with a smile that if it wasn't a demon but a curse, then it seemed like it would be good to find a way to deal with the source of the curse, be it a person or an object. Akira said that he doesn't know anything about magic circles, so he uses the black stone. If they try to sacrifice for the curse, it will harm them. Akira sat in the water on the rocks. His face was thoughtful, then he raised his head and sadly said that the curse can really be very dangerous, you need to be careful with it. The man ran a knife across the skin. Several people with cat ears appeared on the ground. There were magicians in the room, silently watching what was happening. The guy said with a smile that it was true, you need to create a counteraction and then everything will work out, but if this is an ordinary curse, then in that case it would be better to again imagine the black stone in the form of an image. Many people gathered in a room with a magic stone in the center. The guy said with a smile that this is the right and safe way to seal the curse for everyone, and now the activation. One of the main mages felt something and frowned. The darkness was dispelled by a bright glow. It was the magic stone that began to shine. People noticed a bright glow and began to cover their eyes with their hands. The magicians began to fall to the ground and run away screaming. They did not understand what had happened. The slaves were unharmed, nothing happened to them. The magician approached his friend and asked excitedly what was wrong. Was he okay? The guy didn't answer, he was unconscious. He ran up to the main magician and screamed in fear, what was that? The chief magician looked in shock at the magic stone, which was tied with a rope and sealed with an amulet. Akira opened his eyes and was surprised to think that he had just done something. The next moment, Akira stood up and began to pull himself up. Then he said that he was just tired and needed to rest. The golems were holding Akira by his shorts, and a white wolf was standing in front of him. A fluffy one was sitting on Akira's head. Akira said that he was going to bed early today. Half of people came to the settlement. Those who were healthy were dragging their friends on themselves. The girl who worked on the farm screamed in surprise who it was. The dark-haired guy supported the man. Then he raised his head and wearily spoke to them to help them. They came to the neighboring country of Ventura. The king of Ventura, Esmaruit, listened to the report of his subordinates. He asked in surprise that they had deserter slaves from Empress. The king asked that they were not spies, were they? They answered that the slave seal had lost its power. Esmaruit said that the slave seal, the symbol of the power of that country, was true. The subordinate replied that the mages were currently conducting research. The slave who had managed to escape told the doctor that they, as soldiers, had gone to explore the forest. The slave soldiers could not speak except when ordered. He continued to say that they were conscious, but everything always seemed distant in his senses. And then, at that moment, a white light suddenly appeared. Everything suddenly became clear in his head. At that moment, they all ran away. The doctor asked how long ago it was. He answered that they had been wandering in the forest for more than a month. the king held a council to discuss the slaves who had come to their country today. Esmeralda said that in their country, thanks to the forests that stretched between them and the emperor, they somehow managed to stop the advance of aggression. They generally avoid the forest. He continued to say that was right, that was why they didn't dare interfere. The advisor happily shouted that he proposed to investigate. By finding out what made this powerful slave crest disappear, they could find a way to counterattack. Esmeralda said that it was well said, Amigal, but he just wanted to learn this magic. The man excitedly said that no, it was not so. The king said that it was good. The king looked out the window and asked what was really going on in the forest. At that time, Akira was in the middle of the grape harvest in the forest. He happily said that the harvest was rich. The boy told the golems with a smile that they should pick the grapes before the heat rose. Akira got to work. He deftly collected the grapes into a basket. The guy said that thanks to the idea of lowering the temperature around the body, he felt better. Akira thought that the other day when he almost got heat stroke. He said, upset, that he couldn't remember at all. Koa nuzzled the boy's cheek. The boy said that his body had become much lighter. Since then, someone was always next to him. He asked Koa to move away a little. The boy noticed the animal's sly look and shouted loudly that he understood what they wanted, no grapes for them. The animals simultaneously thought that they needed to be looked after. The wolf said that he thought the master's poor health was due to overuse of magic power. The barrier is huge and it requires a lot of magic power. He thought that this magical power was being released there. Koa told his friends that it was not only the quantity, but also its high purity. Suri said that yes, he had never seen or heard of such magic. Karen said that she even got carried away watching it. A sudden loss of magical power could be life-threatening. They all thought it was a bad idea. Koa rested his head on the boy's shoulder and said happily that it seemed like the magic power had become stable. Akira asked in surprise what he was doing now. The boy looked at the grapes he had picked and said happily that he could cook so much. Until now, he had not thought about the luxury and pleasures associated with his main way of life. Akira smiled broadly and thought that the main thing was sake. The guy put the grapes in a large box and said that he really liked beer, but did not have the time to brew it. Akira rolled up his sleeves and shouted loudly that now they would make barrels. They had a lot of wood, so everything would work out. 6 hours passed. The guy wearily thought that making a barrel was really that difficult. He went on to reason that it was probably because he had chosen hard wood, it didn't bend well. They didn't want to take shape. When he thought they had somehow taken shape, they collapsed because of the water. He thought tiredly, that was good. Akira shouted loudly that they were changing course. Koa asked with interest what the gentleman was doing today. The boy said that first they needed to remove the bark and dry them. Suri said he didn't know, but he wanted to lick the sweet-smelling honey. Koa said hesitantly that he didn't think it was honey. The ant shouted for Koa to look. The golems were preparing tonight's dinner. The wolf said he didn't think it was tonight's dinner. Karen drooled and said it smelled pretty interesting. Akira stretched out his hand and said that he would cut the huge tree into round discs 1 meter long. The guy said he would carve out the shapes of the barrels using teleportation magic. Akira happily shouted that magic was cool. Akira stood in front of the many barrels that lined the wall and said with a smile that he should probably expand the floor. Gollum stood nearby and rejoiced along with Akira. The magician stood on one knee in front of the king, while the king put his hand in front of him and began to shout loudly. The emperor angrily shouted that this meant that the magic stone could not be repaired. The magician said fearfully that they had tried several times but nothing worked. The magician who repaired it seemed to have forgotten all memories and magic. The king shouted loudly that it was a simple task that had been done many times before. If they were short of slaves, they could force them to give birth. The emperor walked towards the throne shouting that they had to start all over again right now. The magician said that if they didn't figure out the reason, the same thing would happen again. The king asked what happened to the magicians who tried to fix it. The magician said that they were in the room. The emperor angrily said to kill them. He does not care for useless people. The magician looked after the knights and said, "How is that possible?" The emperor sat on his throne and told them to quickly fix the magic stone. That's an order. The magician replied fearfully that he did. The king looked at his courtiers and thought that this was annoying. They couldn't fix a simple crack. He was sure that there was something missing. He went on to say that the lightning at that time was also strange. The king said that the culprit had to be found. He thought that, interestingly, this was an attack from the other side. The man thought they were planning something to use the forest as camouflage. No country had the strength to resist him. He shouted to the knights that enough of these senseless actions. It was time to calm their hearts. The slaves were lined up in front of the king. The man said with a smile that it had been a long time since he had come here. The first thing to do at such a time was to make some sacrifices. He told the mage that he had tried everything for the last few hundred years and he was tired of it, and now it was time to start. All the commanders were also in this room. Ganmilse looked down at the floor and wondered if he could see this scene again. Full of hope and ideals, he joined the knights, and since then, he told the young ones that being the king's protector was a great honor. Ganmilse remembered his youth. He thought that this was a sight he would never get used to, and he did not want to get used to it, but he had no power to stop the king. The king shouted to the slaves to rejoice, they would become part of his sword. The slaves smiled, but you could see how they were shaking. The king stood still, he raised his sword in the air and did not move. The king tried to hit them, but the light threw the sword aside. Ganmilse covered his face from the bright light. When everything passed, he shouted loudly that the enemy was attacking. Everyone would protect the king. He thought that there was no enemy anywhere to be seen. The dark-haired man grabbed his sword in fear, then he looked at the slaves and thought what kind of strange feeling this was. The magician shouted to the king that he was okay. The king thought in shock that the magician was now talking about why his sword was on the ground. The magician touched the king, but he pushed his hand away. The king saw blood dripping from his hand. He asked in shock why he was bleeding. The magician excitedly said that he would heal. The king thought he had many barriers. He said where his sword was. The magician shouted at him not to move. The emperor asked what it was. The dark-haired man asked that he was asking for forgiveness, but he could take a look. The magician replied that he did not mind. The man took the sword in his hands and asked that this was the evil magic sword. The man thought he didn't feel any power. It was just an old sword. Ganmilse asked what kind of rope it was. It was just grass. The mage replied he wasn't sure, but he thought it was the same as a joke wrapped around a magic stone. Ganmilse thought that the attack from the forest must have had something to do with it. What triggered it? He didn't have enough information. When they finished their investigation, they would think about it. The mage angrily shouted at the boy, asking what he was doing here. Ganmilse asked what was wrong. The mage replied that it was the master who had created the king's sword. He lost consciousness and woke up like this. The dark-haired man looked ahead, his brows furrowing deeply as a thought struck him. Ganmilse looked at the frightened youth and thought that it was the same as the magician, the deceased magic stone. Both times they tried to make a sacrifice. The many fair-haired people stood silently. After a while, they began to look at each other. The next second, sparks pierced the air. The man continued to reason that strange feeling he had experienced before. Ganmilse looked at the slaves who were beginning to gain feelings. He happily thought that maybe they could stop the king. Ganmilse thought, when he was a child, he read the notes of his great-grandfather. It was dangerous there, like the forest looked in the old days. A light breeze blew, and the trees swayed. The forest gave blessings to the people. He continued to reason that when he was little, he was saved in the forest by beastmen. When even the appearances of the forest kings were described, he felt envy. Ganmilse thought that he wanted to see them one day, but in their country you couldn't talk to anyone about the forest. Gamel shouted to his subordinates that right now. Ganmilse approached him and asked if there was destruction going on, right? The man replied that they had started meeting in strange places. Ganmilse said that he didn't want to come here, but still. He asked that it seemed that the mood was not very good, wasn't it? Gamol shouted loudly that, of course, as soon as he had a chance to show his rage in the forest, he was simply sent to rest. Now he can't even slaughter slaves. Ganmilse asked him in surprise what he meant. The knight told Gamel that because of what had happened to the king, perhaps he should refrain from such actions, at least for now. Gamol shouted angrily that he knew. He wanted to lose his temper. Ganmilse said that it seemed that recent events had had an effect. Perhaps this would be useful. He and his subordinate came to the man. Ganmilse thought that there were more important things to destroy now. He told the man that he wanted to rent slaves. He opened the door and they went inside. Ganmilse covered his nose with his hand and said that it was just a terrible smell. The slave manager said that he apologized and that the golem would clean everything thoroughly on cleaning day. He told the adult slaves to stand up. Ganmilse looked at the slaves carefully and noticed a boy who looked away. He told the manager that he was choosing him. He picked out a couple more slaves. The manager asked nervously that they would be killed. Since they were short of slaves, why not keep the females if possible? Ganmilse thought angrily if there was a reason for that. He smiled and said that he wanted to use them for a special mission. He could put a mark on them in case he had to rent them again. Akiro and the wolf came to the farm. The boy thought that the pleasant autumn weather had come so quickly. He looked at the finished harvest and joyfully shouted that he thought so. Akira hugged his friends and shouted with a smile that it was amazing, they were all here. He thought that this was the place he had seen in the distance when he was expanding the borders before. The boy said with a smile that they spent a day and a half on this, it paid off. The wolf happily asked what smelled so delicious. Akira replied that he was glad to see their happy faces. The wolf said that it seemed that this herb was tasty, I wanted to try it. The wolf laughed and said that they say that the gentleman will cook anything deliciously. Akira picked a stalk and said that it looked like wheat, didn't it, where the seeds came from. He tasted it and said that it was good and edible. The boy said that he used magic to hold the tip in place while he cut, and now they could put it all together. All his friends started helping him harvest. Akira said with a smile that it was good that there was grain in this world too. If all went well, he would be able to bake the baked goods he dreamed of. The boy said that everyone must be worried, so they should hurry back. The wolf lay down on the ground and shouted that it would be faster. Akira thought happily that this was what he was thinking about. He asked excitedly that it was true, he could sit down. The wolf shouted that they were going home. The wolf quickly ran home, leaving the other animals behind him. Kola ran out of the house and shouted happily that he had been gone for almost 2 days. What happened? He was very worried. Akira covered his mouth with his hand so that he wouldn't throw up after the fast ride. He said wearily that he was home. The wolf said happily that he thought so, and hurried to bring the master back as quickly as possible. Kao said with a smile that Hio had done his job well. Akira thought that the road that took more than a day, they covered in 3 hours and returned home. He was very tired after such a trip, he will still recover for a long time. The king angrily shouted that the 5th Night Squad, as soon as the preparations were completed, they should immediately go to suppress the village. It seemed that there were those who intended to oppose him. Gamol said with a smile that he had been waiting for these words. He would definitely drag the enemies into the light of the sun. The king said that he could take with him everything he needed. Gamol said that only magicians and slaves were needed. The king smiled and said that he had some plan. Okay, he could take as many as he wanted. The man left the throne room. The king laughed and thought that he should have done it sooner. He said that if it was the 5th order of knights, they would get the job done. The knight said that he asked for forgiveness. A report came from the slave manager. The king smiled evilly and said that he could speak. He thought that yes, he should be feared. The knight said that it seemed that there were changes in the behavior of some of the slaves. The king asked in surprise what the changes were, anomalies in the slave mark. He was told that no, there were no reports of this. The king will say that the one who changed should simply be killed. They can replenish the amount that was lost. The knight said that it was good. The emperor said that he was interested in who they would bring with them.